Welcome, friend, to this peaceful hour where we gently peel back the layers of time. Tonight, our story takes place in a world far removed from ours, but still tenderly human. Whether you're drifting off or just looking to slow the pace of your evening, I'm grateful you're here. I'd love to hear where you're listening from. You'll also see just how perilous a path to the altar could be. But let me tell you, it was anything but. The wedding feast was a spectacle of epic proportions, lasting up to 10 days. Marrying your sweetheart was a luxury most couldn't afford. How about a gentle lullaby to send you off to dreamland? Why not listen to my nightly lullabies and relax to the sound of my soothing voice? Tonight's tale might have chilled you to the bone, but rest assured, tomorrow we'll weave a new tale. A fresh story from the tapestry of time to keep you company. Thank you for joining me on this journey through history. Until next time, farewell. In fact, most marriages were arranged for a political or financial gain, leaving little room for love or affection. The bride and groom often met for the first time on their wedding day. Can you imagine walking down the aisle without ever having laid eyes on your soon-to-be spouse? Talk about a blind date gone wrong. Love marriages, while not unheard of, were rare. And even when two people were genuinely in love, their feelings were often frowned upon. Society frowned upon romantic love, viewing it as a distraction from the true purpose of marriage, procreation. Parents arranged marriages for their children, often without considering their feelings or compatibility. Marriages were made between families, not individuals, and love was seen as a bonus, not a prerequisite. Sometimes, however, the medieval world did provide a happy ending. There were cases of couples who went against societal norms and eloped, proving that love could indeed conquer all. But these were the exceptions, not the rule. For most, marriage was a duty, not a romance. And love, well, that was a luxury reserved for fairy tales, not reality. So if you're sitting there thinking your marriage woes are just too much to bear, just remember, it could have been much worse. You could have been stuck in the Middle Ages with an arranged marriage to a stranger. Now, that would be a nightmare scenario. It was a time for celebration, dancing, and, yes, a whole lot of debauchery. Think medieval Mardi Gras with more mead and fewer beads. The festivities included drinking, gambling, and music, and it was common for guests to stay up all night and party. It was also customary for the bride to be carried to a separate chamber, not by her groom, but by 4 men. And once inside, her ladies-in-waiting would undress her, cut off her hair, and throw it into the crowd. The men would then carry her to a new chamber where she would spend the night with them. Not in a bridal suite, mind you, but in the same room with 4 posts in each corner. And yes, you guessed it, the men would sleep in those corners, each guarding a post. But wait, there's more. They would also rub the bride's body with salt, presumably to preserve it for the groom's arrival later in the evening. It wasn't unusual for one of the men to end up sleeping with the bride, but don't get too excited. This was not a romantic tryst. It was a rite of passage to mark her transition into womanhood. And the man who slept with her was chosen for his virility, not his charm. So if you think your wedding night was awkward, just be glad you didn't live in the Middle Ages. For starters, the vows you and I exchanged today were a medieval invention. Until the 1400s, there were no vows at all. No promises of love, devotion, or commitment. Can you imagine? Marriage was more of a business transaction than a romantic partnership. It was common for couples not to even see each other before the wedding. And the ceremony itself was more like a formality than a heartfelt exchange of love. Vows may seem like a simple addition to our ceremonies, but they were a revolutionary idea during the Middle Ages. It wasn't until the 1400s that someone dared to suggest that perhaps a marriage should be based on more than just tradition and societal pressure. The first known written marriage vow comes from a Scottish source, a testament to the bravery it took to express such a radical idea at the time. Today, we take these vows for granted, but they represent a huge step forward in the history of human relationships. Imagine the courage it took to publicly declare your love and commitment to another person in a time when society dictated that marriage was more of a business deal than a partnership based on emotions. The inclusion of vows made the wedding ceremony a much more personal and intimate affair. Couples were encouraged to express their love and commitment to one another, making the special day a true celebration of their bond rather than just an obligatory event. So next time you stand at the altar and exchange vows with your partner, take a moment to appreciate the significance of this tradition. It is only through the bravery of those who came before us that we can now publicly declare our love and commitment to one another without fear of reprisal. And the wedding night, well, let's just say it was rarely the fairy tale ending we dream of. Join me as we uncover the hidden truths behind the veil of medieval tradition. Get ready to be surprised, shocked, and maybe even a little bit disturbed as we explore a world where love took a backseat to duty, where innocence was lost on the altar of tradition, and where the wedding night could mean very different things. Things than saying, I do, what city or country, and what time it is as you press play. It always amazes me how history can bring strangers together. If this kind of calm historical storytelling brings you peace, consider subscribing. We have many more stories to lull us into the quiet night. But first, let me share something that will blow your mind. The average age for a girl to be married in medieval times was an 18 or even 16. In some regions, girls as young as 12 were considered ready for marriage, and the wedding night that followed was often their first, and sometimes final encounter with the brutal realities of adult life. This isn't some distant historical footnote. We can brush aside this was the lived reality for millions of women across centuries of human history. Now you might be thinking, surely the wealthy had it better, right? Wrong. If anything, the stakes were even higher for noble families where a single wedding could determine the fate of entire kingdoms, and the bride was often nothing more than a pawn in a deadly game of political chess. Why? Because in medieval Europe, marriage wasn't just a union of two people in love. It was an intricate dance of alliances, land ownership, and power struggles. Take, for example, the infamous marriage between Henry Tudor and Elizabeth of York. This wedding in 1486 united the warring houses of Lancaster and York, effectively ending the Wars of the Roses and establishing the Tudor dynasty. The young bride and groom were little more than figureheads, their destinies intertwined in the grand political chess game orchestrated by their families. The real power lay with those pulling the strings from the shadows, ensuring that the marriage went beyond the union of two individuals to become a symbol of the union of entire nations. As we delve deeper into the world of medieval nuptials, you'll meet brave young girls who defied the odds and lived to tell their tale. When it comes to medieval weddings, we all like to imagine a quaint ceremony filled with love and romance. But enough about the ceremony. Let's talk about the reception, because the party didn't stop after the vows were exchanged. Oh no. Medieval marriage was often a necessary evil, a means to an end, and that's all for tonight. Did this chill you to the bone, or maybe creep you out just a little? The bride nervously adjusted her veil, trying to quell the swarm of butterflies fluttering around in her stomach. Today was her wedding day, the day she would marry the man she didn't know and most likely never see again. They met for the first time on her wedding day and saw each other for the last time on her wedding night. Today we're exploring what really went down on the first night of marriage in the Middle Ages. While today's weddings are predominantly a celebration of love between two people, the institution of marriage in the Middle Ages was primarily a political and economic tool. While with his left hand he'd take hold of the left thigh, and so turn her from back to front, and lift up the said skirt and shift, and put it off from the said woman. Marrying young girls to older men was common practice. Most brides were in their early teens, while grooms were often a decade or more their senior. Often married off by their parents without consulting them, Girls had no say in the selection of their partners and no idea what to expect on their wedding night. Why? Because her body belonged to her husband and resistance was futile. Groaning and vomiting were normal reactions to the trauma of the wedding night, as were fainting and seizures. Such injuries, particularly to the neck and chest, were shockingly common, offering a glimpse into the brutal reality of consummation. What does this tell us? Consent didn't exist. Women were expected to submit regardless of their age, status, or personal feelings. If they refused, they were forcibly subdued. We will explore the perilous journey of motherhood in the Middle Ages, the chilling tales of infanticide, and the alarming frequency of widowhood. Also, we've made a playlist of other videos that you might like. It has all of our episodes on medieval wives and mothers. Check it out. Thanks for watching. Each episode promises to peel back another layer of a society that seems both alien and horrifyingly familiar. And if they fought back, they were bitten and injured. Injuries such as sore breasts, bruises, wounds, inflammation, and lacerations were commonly treated by doctors. She wrote, "I was sent for to a sick chamber where a gentlewoman lay who was newly married. She had not been in her bed long when I came to her. And she cried out, 'Alas, help, for I am hurt.' When I came into the chamber, I found her husband there. He had done that hurt to her, and had pulled away her kirtle and smock, and was doing his filthiness with her against her will. The poor girl was but 14 years old, and had not been married long when she became ill. Her family sent for Agnes to see if she could help, but all Agnes found was a traumatized young girl and a smirking, satisfied husband." To put things in perspective, during the same time period, medical professionals were trained to treat traumatic injuries by letting blood. Imagine the state of medieval medicine when bloodletting was the go-to treatment for everything from headaches to gunshots. Doctors of the era advised men to use force if their wives resisted, and women were expected to accept pain as part of the marriage vows. The church supported this view, saying that the pain and discomfort associated with the loss of virginity was a divinely ordained punishment for Eve's sin in the Garden of Eden. One can only imagine the terror and trauma experienced by these young women on their wedding nights. It serves as a stark reminder of the challenges that women have historically faced and continue to face in asserting their rights and safety. But it doesn't end there. They were typically given very little to no preparation for what was about to happen. Some brides didn't even know what to wear to the wedding. It was considered scandalous for a woman to know how to dress herself, and it was her mother's duty to make sure she was appropriately covered from head to toe. Even simple actions such as using a chamber pot were unknown to these young brides. You can imagine the state of affairs when they were led to the bridal chamber. It was believed that young girls were more pliable, easier to control, and more likely to bear children. Children were seen as a reflection of their father's lineage, so men wanted to ensure that any child born to them was truly theirs. If a young bride failed to produce male heirs, the marriage was considered a failure, and she might be subjected to further abuse. In some cases, she may have been accused of witchcraft or heresy and persecuted for not fulfilling her primary role as a childbearer. In a book called The Book of Secrets, written in the 15th century, instructions on how to please a woman were provided, assuming the reader was already married. The text advised men to approach their wives from behind and begin thrusting, suggesting that since the woman could not see him coming, she would be less likely to resist. Historical records indicate that some grooms used drugs to render their brides unconscious, ensuring compliance. All of these traditions show that the wedding night was not about love or romance. It was about taking what was rightfully yours as a husband. And if your bride resisted, it was your right to subdue her. Royal and noble families used strategic marriages to forge alliances, to strengthen their positions, and to pass on wealth. Often, as was the case with Blanche, the bride and groom had no say in the arrangement. Marriages were often decided by fathers and kings who saw their daughters and subjects as pieces in a game of chess, moving them around the board to gain advantage. A few hours later, Blanche gave birth to a stillborn son. The next morning, she was sent back to France. No one ever asked why. It was also the day she would most likely first experience sex. It was 1369, and the French king had just married a 12-year-old English girl named Blanche of Lancaster to the future King Wenceslas of Bohemia. These forced marriages were nothing like the romantic ceremonies we see today. For the vast majority of women, especially those of higher social status, it was their first and last experience of sex. Their virginity was highly prized, as it was seen as a commodity that could be traded and lost only once. As soon as she was wed, she was expected to be taken to the bridal chamber. This transition was often described in extremely graphic detail in historical records. Welcome to my channel. Now, let's delve into the raw realities of those arranged marriages and the disturbing practices surrounding the consummation of these unions. In 1482, monks wrote, "He shall then uncover the said woman's thighs, and with his right hand take hold of the right thigh." Oftentimes, as was the case with Blanche of Castile, the wedding night was also the first night of motherhood. In addition to the threat of abuse and persecution, many brides were also physically unprepared for the ordeal. Even if a bride was well prepared, which was rare, she was still likely doomed to fail. Medical texts from the time discuss injuries commonly sustained by brides, revealing a horrifying reality of sexual violence. But perhaps the most distressing injuries treated by medieval doctors were those resulting from human bites. Here's a first-hand account from Agnes Paston, an English noblewoman who lived during the turbulent 15th century. This dark chapter of history compels us to confront the grim reality of the past and acknowledge the roots of our modern struggles for gender equality and bodily autonomy. In the subsequent episodes of our series, we will delve deeper into the dark realities of medieval marriage. What did you find most shocking about the wedding night in the Middle Ages? Did anything surprise you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. In 1364, 7-year-old Blanche of Bourbon gave birth to a son. This marked the beginning of an astonishing chapter in her life because over the next 28 years, she would give birth to 12 children, a feat that earned her the nickname the Childbed Queen. Medieval records are filled with accounts of women who died in childbirth, often after producing several children. The journey through childbirth was fraught with danger, and death wasn't just a possibility, it was a constant companion. In fact, if we go back to the time of Shakespeare, the risk of dying in childbirth was about 1 in 70 in England, a rate significantly higher than today. The medieval period saw staggering infant mortality rates, with some estimates suggesting that as many as half of all children died before reaching the age of 5 and 60% dying before the age of 10. The Christian view of women's roles, largely shaped by biblical interpretations, emphasized their role in bearing children as ordained by God. This religious context, combined with cultural traditions, created a society that often subjugated women, limiting their access to education, controlling their economic resources, and denying them agency over their own bodies. Those who did survive often entered into a cycle that mirrored their mothers. Their value was derived from the sheer quantity of offspring they produced, a measure of their worth that had both societal and political implications. As a queen, her primary role was to produce legitimate heirs, and with each lost child, she faced the pressure of having to try again. But this longevity came at a cost. Her body, subjected to the rigors of childbirth and hormonal fluctuations, bore the scars of a life lived on the edge of mortality. Her story serves as a reminder of the human cost of these historical milestones, the toll on the women whose bodies and lives were defined by their reproductive roles. Some, like Blanche, leverage their positions to secure alliances and advance their family's interests. They challenge the common perception of the medieval period as a monolithic era and invite us to examine the nuances of a time that continues to shape our world today. Others, like Isabella, found themselves caught in a web of duty and loss, their choices constrained by the expectations of their time. Political alliances, land transactions, and economic partnerships were common motivations behind these marriages. For example, the infamous marriage between Blanche and the future Charles V came about as a means to secure the succession to the French throne. Love and compatibility were not factors in this arrangement. It was primarily a bond between families, a means to maintain bloodlines and solidify social standing. Men had absolute authority within the marriage, with women expected to obey and submit. Women, on the other hand, were expected to accept their husbands' infidelities without complaint. The legal system also favored men, giving them greater rights and protections. For instance, men could initiate divorce proceedings, but women could not, unless they had sufficient grounds like adultery. The double standards were evident, and the power imbalances were clear. The consequences of violating these norms were vastly different for men and women, with women often facing greater social stigma and legal repercussions. The subordination of women was widely accepted, and men's dominance extended to various aspects of daily life. The vows exchanged might have sounded hollow in the face of such stark realities. While women were expected to remain virgins until marriage, men's sexual conduct was judged differently. Extramarital affairs, while frowned upon, were more often seen as a test of masculinity than a moral failing for men. It was a time when women were often reduced to their reproductive roles, their lives measured by their ability to bear children. The high rates of infant mortality and the societal pressures to marry young and bear heirs made every pregnancy a gamble, every birth a victory, and every lost child a devastating blow. The stories of women like Blanche and Isabella offer a glimpse into this often overlooked reality, reminding us that history is not just about kings and conquests, but about the lives and struggles of ordinary people. From their unequal roles in marriage to the different sets of rules that govern their behavior, men and women existed under entirely different sets of expectations and constraints. And the commitment of lifelong fidelity became meaningless in the context of a society that accepted polygamy and concubinage. Actions that would be considered scandalous today were commonplace then, reflecting a different set of values and societal norms. Love, if it occurred, was considered a pleasant addition to the union, but certainly not its foundation. This pressure, combined with the physical strain of repeated pregnancies and childbirths, took a significant toll on her, leading to her death at the relatively young age of 36. Concubines, women who lived with men in a committed but unofficial relationship, were common. Sometimes these relationships were tolerated, even by a man's wife, as a means to produce legitimate heirs. In other cases, concubines were preferred to wives, allowing men to avoid the complications and restrictions of formal marriage. Girls were typically married off as soon as they reached physical maturity, sometimes as young as 12 or 13, perpetuating a system that valued them solely for their reproductive capabilities. The physical demands of bearing multiple children took a heavy toll on women's bodies, often leading to health complications, exhaustion, and in many cases, death. Their choices and actions, though often limited by societal norms, could have profound consequences. Marriage, for instance, wasn't just a matter of personal preference, but a strategic alliance with far-reaching implications. A queen's choice of spouse could affect not just the dynasty, but the entire kingdom. The lack of medical understanding and safe practices during the medieval period exacerbated these issues, turning a natural process into a life-threatening ordeal. These deaths, while tragic, weren't treated as such. They were seen as unfortunate but expected occupational hazards of being a woman. The risks were so ingrained in societal awareness that artists and writers frequently depicted them in their works. For example, the German painter Lucas Cranach Elder produced two versions of a painting titled Madonna with the Death of the Infant Jesus, each depicting the Virgin Mary cradling a dead Christ child. Unlike Blanche, Isabella experienced a different side of medieval motherhood. While she managed to outlive most of her children, 4 of her 5 sons died in infancy or early childhood. This wasn't unusual. As mentioned earlier, infant mortality was rampant, and boys were particularly vulnerable. But the emotional and psychological impact on Isabella shouldn't be overlooked. Similarly, Shakespeare explored this grim reality in Romeo and Juliet, where the nurse recounts having lost 6 children of her own in similar fashion. The births made Blanche one of the most influential women in France, cementing her family's status and royal connections. However, beneath the grandeur of her accomplishments lay a different story, a story of immense physical toll on her body as she repeatedly endured the rigors of pregnancy, childbirth, and the perpetual threat of losing a child. Her story, therefore, becomes more than just her personal struggle with repeated pregnancies. It reflects a broader social context where women were defined largely by their reproductive roles. The medieval period viewed women primarily as vessels for producing heirs, their value measured by their ability to bear children, especially sons. For every success story like Blanche's, there were countless women who weren't so fortunate. These grim statistics highlight a stark truth about medieval life, particularly for women. When Blanche was born in 1326, she entered a world where this grim reality was simply accepted. But these children, the products of these high-risk pregnancies, also faced their own set of brutal realities. This perspective on women's roles was deeply ingrained in medieval society, influenced heavily by religious beliefs and cultural norms. Within this framework, women like Blanche, who successfully bore numerous children, were celebrated, not necessarily for their personal strength or resilience, but for fulfilling their perceived God-given role. However, for every Blanche who achieved this level of success, there were countless others who suffered terribly. The story of Queen Isabella of Castile, wife of King Ferdinand II, provides another perspective on this grim reality. Each child's death represented not just a personal loss, but a blow to her status and her husband's dynasty. Unlike Isabella, Blanche managed to outlive all of her children. Despite the grim realities, women like Blanche and Isabella played pivotal roles in their societies. Yet within this context of limited rights and brutal realities, these women navigated their roles with varying degrees of agency and cunning. Their stories, often overshadowed by the hardships they faced, reveal the complexity of medieval life. Medieval marriage, however, was not merely an institution based on love and companionship. Women, particularly those of noble birth, were often married off for reasons that had nothing to do with affection. While some medieval marriages might have started with ceremony and good intentions, they could quickly turn sour. Men could take additional wives, often for practical reasons, such as ensuring the continuation of their lineage, or for less noble reasons like the desire for sexual gratification outside of marriage. Monogamous marriages, while the ideal, were not always the norm. The acceptance of such practices highlights the blurred lines of medieval morality. The disparities in treatment between men and women during the Middle Ages were stark and pervasive. Women were often confined to domestic roles, expected to manage a household and bear children, while men had more freedom to pursue careers, own property, and participate in public life. These double standards were deeply ingrained in medieval society and were often justified, using religious doctrines and traditional gender roles. In the realm of sexual morality, men were allowed greater leeway. This double standard created a society where men enjoyed more freedoms and privileges. While women's lives were heavily restricted, their actions constantly scrutinized. So while the Middle Ages may seem like a distant, almost fairy tale-like period, the realities of life, particularly for women, were far from enchanting. Medieval weddings. A deeper look at the horrifying truth. When we think of medieval weddings, we often picture charming ceremonies filled with love and joy. However, the reality of medieval weddings was far from the fairy tale. In this video, we will delve deep into the horrifying truth behind medieval weddings, exploring the dark side of this seemingly joyous occasion. Upon marriage, a woman's legal existence was often subsumed under her husband's, and she was expected to obey his authority. In many cases, women couldn't own property in their own name, and their ability to work was restricted. Medieval weddings were not always safe events, and violence was not uncommon. She was expected to conform to strict gender roles, and her movements and interactions were closely monitored. During the wedding ceremony, the bride was often veiled, which not only symbolized her subordination, but also physically isolated her from her surroundings. It was deeply ingrained in the fabric of medieval society, reflecting a culture that normalized violence against women and children. The acceptance of such practices permeated all levels of society, from the nobility to the commoners, and was perpetuated by prevailing religious and cultural norms. Within this context, the value placed on women as objects of property rather than human beings with rights and autonomy contributed significantly to the normalization of their mistreatment. It was a testament to the prevailing attitudes and beliefs that allowed for the mistreatment of women and children in the pursuit of social, economic, or political objectives. The normalization of violence and abuse within marriage had ripple effects throughout medieval culture, influencing everything from literature to law to religious teaching. The absence of legal protections and the subjugation of women within a patriarchal system allowed for the perpetuation of violence against them, including the forced marriage of young girls. They were brutal, terrifying experiences for young girls who were subjected to a system that valued their obedience and subservience over their safety and well-being. We hope this video has provided you with a deeper understanding of the brutal realities of this historical practice. If you found this video informative and impactful, please consider liking it and sharing it with others who might also be interested in this topic. Your support helps us continue to produce educational content that sheds light on important historical events. Additionally, if you haven't already, we encourage you to subscribe to our channel to stay updated on our latest videos. It's crucial to confront the dark reality of medieval weddings and understand the lasting impact of these practices on individuals and society as a whole. By shedding light on this horrifying truth, we not only pay tribute to the countless victims of medieval wedding abuses, but also gain a deeper understanding of the struggles for equality and justice that continue to shape our world today. Recognizing the horrors of the past allows us to work toward a future where every individual, regardless of gender or age, is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. As a result, medieval weddings became a microcosm of the broader societal issues, reflecting a culture that tolerated and even endorsed the exploitation and abuse of women and children. After the ceremony, she was typically confined to the bedroom where consummation of the marriage took place. The depiction of medieval weddings in literature, film, and television tends to focus on the idealized aspects of courtly love and chivalry, creating a distorted and inaccurate portrayal of these events. It was deeply intertwined with broader social, cultural, and religious norms that permeated medieval society. The Catholic Church played a significant role in shaping these norms, and its teachings and practices had a profound impact on the treatment of women and children during this era. The Church's doctrine on marriage emphasized obedience and submission, often at the expense of women's autonomy and well-being. Religious leaders frequently justified the subjugation of women within marriage by invoking biblical passages that reinforced patriarchal authority. Moreover, their rituals and ceremonies surrounding medieval weddings often served to highlight the transfer of women from the control of one man, typically the father, to another, emphasizing their subordinate status. The church's influence in shaping these norms and practices contributed significantly to the perpetuation of violence and exploitation against women and children during medieval weddings. It's important to approach media representations of medieval weddings with a critical lens, understanding that they often serve to perpetuate harmful stereotypes and misconceptions rather than provide an authentic representation of history. To gain a more accurate understanding of medieval weddings, it's crucial to consult scholarly sources and historical records that provide a more objective and nuanced perspective on these events. By doing so, we can better appreciate the true nature of medieval weddings and the significant impact they had on the lives of those who experienced them. This ritual was highly gendered, and the bride's compliance was seen as crucial for establishing her reputation and value within the community. Men were known to beat their brides if they didn't meet their expectations or if there were disputes over dowries. The sudden transition from childhood to forced adulthood, coupled with the absence of emotional connection or intimacy, created a profound sense of disorientation and despair. Many girls were thrust into marriages without any say in the selection of their partners, subjecting them to the risk of abusive or exploitative relationships. The secrecy surrounding the consummation of marriage further exacerbated the trauma, as girls were often left to navigate this intimate act without guidance or support. The psychological impact of these experiences was compounded by the societal norms that discouraged or prohibited discussions about sexual and reproductive health. Consequently, many young brides lacked the knowledge and agency to protect themselves, leading to heightened vulnerability and potential for abuse. In extreme cases, men would even kill their wives if they were deemed unacceptable. There were also instances of bride kidnapping, where men would forcibly take women to become their wives without their consent. Such practices were often justified through religious and cultural beliefs that supported male dominance and female subordination. Men were seen as the head of the household and had the authority to make decisions for their wives, including choosing their partners. Women were often not allowed to refuse a marriage proposal, and resistance could result in severe consequences. They were financially dependent on men, whether fathers, brothers, or husbands, which made it difficult for them to leave abusive situations or seek a divorce. Join us as we uncover the shocking practices that took place during medieval weddings and separate fact from fiction. For many families, marrying off their daughters was primarily an economic transaction. Dowries were common, and the amount and value of the dowry a woman brought to the marriage were crucial for her family's financial security. Families often struggled to accumulate sufficient dowries for their daughters, and the pressure to provide a substantial dowry could lead to extreme measures. In some cases, families might take loans or use whatever resources they had to meet the dowry demands, which placed a significant financial burden on the bride's family. The pressure to provide a substantial dowry could also lead to exploitation and abuse of the young bride. Extreme youth. The age of consent in the Middle Ages varied across Europe, and there wasn't a standardized legal age. However, it's widely documented that girls were married at extremely young ages, often in their early teens. This practice was common among the nobility as well as the commoners. Arranged marriages were the norm, and parents had significant influence over their daughters' choice of partners. Marrying off daughters at a young age served several purposes. It was seen as a way to ensure the continuation of family bloodlines, protect a daughter's virginity before marriage, and secure alliances with other families through strategic marriages. The lack of education and limited opportunities for women also contributed to the prevalence of child marriage. Legal powerlessness. Women in the Middle Ages had very limited legal rights and were considered legally inferior to men. Economic pressure. Physical danger. Social isolation. Medieval weddings were typically large events that brought together members of the community. However, for the bride, it was often an isolating experience. The psychology of the brutality. Beyond the physical and economic aspects, medieval weddings inflicted psychological damage on young girls, leaving lasting trauma that extended beyond the wedding night, a society forged in violence. The brutality of medieval weddings was not merely an aberration or a product of individual malice, separating fact from fiction. While popular culture often romanticizes medieval weddings, it's essential to recognize that this portrayal is far from the historical reality. The legacy of brutality. The brutality of medieval weddings did not exist in a vacuum. Beyond the individual acts of abuse and exploitation, the brutality of medieval weddings was a reflection of a society that failed to protect the rights and dignity of its most vulnerable members. Conclusion. Medieval weddings were far from the romantic ceremonies we often imagine. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the harrowing truth behind medieval weddings. Hey there, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to discuss the shocking truth about medieval weddings. So grab your goblet, grab a seat, and let's get started. And if you'd like to support us, check out our membership options. The contributions help us to keep producing these videos. Yet in actuality was a stark reminder of societal norms, power structures, and unfortunately the brutal treatment of women. Join me as we unravel the dark secrets and disturbing practices that lurked beneath the surface of these seemingly joyous occasions. Also, if you're interested in learning more about medieval history, be sure to visit our website where you can find news, views, and reviews from a medieval perspective. She was adorned in finery, jewels, and elaborate headdresses that signified her elevated status, at least for this one day. During the ceremony, the couple would have exchanged vows and rings, and perhaps most importantly, their hands would have been joined together as a symbol of their union. This act symbolized the bride as surrender to her new family and her acceptance of her role as a submissive wife. Marriage was not just about love and companionship. It was a cornerstone of the social order. It facilitated the transfer of wealth and property, ensured the continuation of lineages, and most importantly, allowed men to exert control over women. By understanding the complexities and harsh realities of medieval marriage, we gain insight into a world where power, control, and societal norms often overshadowed individual rights and personal happiness. We must recognize that history is complex and nuanced, and that individuals from the past should be understood within the context of their own times. The ceremony was not merely a spiritual union, but a legal and social contract that bound the couple and their families together. Was there anything that you found surprising or thought was particularly disturbing? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Also, what other aspects of medieval life would you like us to explore in future videos? We'd love to hear your suggestions. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss an exciting episode. Thanks for joining us today. Stay curious and keep exploring the captivating world of medieval history. Until next time, farewell. The practices and beliefs of the time should be examined within their historical context, recognizing that they were the product of values and norms of a bygone era. Firstly, supporting educational initiatives that promote media literacy and critical thinking skills enables individuals to navigate online content responsibly and to critically examine the information they encounter. Secondly, promoting open and inclusive dialogue encourages individuals to engage in respectful conversations about sensitive topics, fostering empathy and understanding. Finally, encouraging historical research and preservation efforts helps to ensure that diverse perspectives and experiences from history are documented and shared. fostering a more comprehensive understanding of the past. It is equally important to acknowledge that the experiences of individuals during the Middle Ages varied widely based on factors such as social class, gender, and geographic location. While it's true that many women face significant challenges and injustices within the institution of marriage, it's essential to avoid generalizations and recognize the diversity of experiences that existed. It was a binding agreement that carried significant weight in medieval society. Her clothing was not just a fashion statement, but a reflection of her family's wealth and influence. One such ritual was the veil or the bridle. The bride would be veiled or have a bridle placed on her head as she entered the ceremony. This symbolized her submission to her husband and her transformation from a free-spirited maiden to a tamed and obedient wife. Another disturbing aspect of medieval weddings was the bride price, a payment made by the groom or his family to the bride's family. This payment was essentially a purchase price, reflecting the commodification of women and their value as property. The bride price varied depending on social status and economic circumstances, but it was a necessary expense to secure the right to marry. For instance, Queen Elizabeth's wedding gown, which you can see here, was lavishly decorated with gold thread and intricate designs, symbolizing her royal status and the power of the Tudor dynasty. The groom, too, would don his finest garments, often including a decorated doublet, a ruff, and a feathered cap, signifying his status as a member of the nobility. Before we begin, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Today we're diving deep into the historical reality of medieval weddings, an event that seems like a celebration of love and commitment. Medieval weddings were primarily a means to form alliances, solidify social standing, and above all, ensure the continuation of bloodlines. Marriages were often arranged between families long before the bride and groom, usually children themselves, had any say in the matter. Love had no place in this equation. It was a transaction conducted by parents seeking to enhance their social or economic status. Families would carefully consider factors such as wealth, social standing, and lineage when selecting a partner for their child. Dowries were a critical component of these negotiations, with the bride's family providing substantial gifts to the groom or his family to secure the match. These dowries often included land, money, jewelry, and household goods, essentially a financial investment to ensure the groom's commitment and provide for his future. Now let's talk about consent, or rather the lack thereof. In medieval times, consent played a minimal role in marriage. The concept of romantic love and individual choice was not prioritized over social obligations and familial authority. Marriages were often prearranged with little or no say from the individuals involved. And as mentioned earlier, the bride's family would negotiate the terms of the marriage contract, which the bride herself could not refuse. In fact, a woman could be forcibly married against her will with little recourse. Under the prevailing laws and customs of the time, the marriage vows themselves were a formality. They were a declaration of submission and obedience, rather than an exchange of love and commitment between equals. The bride's attire was a symbol of her status and value within society. The wedding ceremony itself was a grand affair. It was a public event with religious overtones designed to impress and intimidate those in attendance. And speaking of submission, medieval weddings also involved rituals that emphasized the bride's subordination to her groom. While the institution of marriage in medieval times may seem archaic and unsettling, it's crucial to remember that it was deeply ingrained in the social fabric of the era. It is important to approach this topic with sensitivity and awareness of the power dynamics that shape medieval marriages. Here are some ways we can contribute to a better understanding and remembrance of this aspect of history. Remember, we can learn from history by acknowledging both the positive and negative aspects of the past and working towards a better future. All right, It's time for you to join the conversation. What shocked you the most about medieval weddings? In the chilling chronicles of history, there are tales of unimaginable cruelty that make us shudder. Among the darkest chapters is one that delves into the horrifying reality of medieval marriages. Your support means the world to us and inspires us to keep bringing you fascinating historical content. Now let's embark on this eye-opening journey. Prepare to be shocked as we uncover the gruesome details of medieval marriage customs that will leave you questioning the very nature of human relationships. They were primarily alliances based on economics, power, and the continuation of bloodlines. Religious doctrine portrayed women as inherently sinful, the daughters of Eve who had brought sin into the world. Marriage was presented as a necessary evil to contain female sexuality and ensure legitimate heirs. The emotional and psychological toll on these women was immeasurable. Though rarely documented, letters and diaries from literate noble women provide glimpses into their desperation. Their stories serve as a haunting reminder of the urgent need for change and a testament to the strength and resilience of women throughout history. Many spoke of praying for death rather than enduring another pregnancy or beatings. The absence of emotional connection and mutual respect led to countless unhappy marriages and the suffering of countless individuals. Others described feeling like trapped animals, valued only for their wounds and silenced. It's disturbing to reflect on how this custom reduced individuals to mere objects of trade and perpetuated a system that valued women primarily for their economic worth. If a girl was found to have had sex before marriage, she could face severe consequences, including being burned at the stake. Women lived in constant fear of being accused of sexual misconduct, knowing that false accusations could lead to horrific outcomes. A girl could be forced into marriage without her consent, and her virginity was highly valued. This lack of bodily autonomy meant that women had no control over their own sexuality or reproductive rights. Marriages were often arranged for political or economic gain, and women were treated as possessions to be exchanged. Women were denied the fundamental right to make decisions about their own bodies and futures. Such laws were rooted in deeply ingrained misogyny and the belief that women were inferior to men. Husbands held absolute authority over their wives, and any form of resistance or disobedience was met with severe punishment. Men were permitted to beat their wives as a means of discipline, and women were forbidden from defending themselves against physical abuse. It's disturbing to realize how this custom contributed to the objectification of women and their reduction to mere bargaining chips in economic transactions. Without the right to refuse unwanted advances, women were trapped in abusive situations with little to no escape. Women were stripped of their dignity and reduced to objects of male pleasure and control. The bride was literally given away by her father to her husband, symbolizing the transfer of ownership. The act of carrying the bride over the threshold represented the symbolic capture of a woman and her entrance into her husband's domain. These rituals not only reinforced patriarchal norms, but also served as a stark reminder of a woman's subordinate status. Vows included promises of obedience, pledging a wife's submission to her husband's authority. To dive deeper into our content, click the subscribe button and become part of our community. Together, let's continue exploring the captivating narratives that shape our world. They reflected a patriarchal society determined to control women's sexuality and punish those who dared to defy societal norms. Thank you for joining us on this journey through time. Keep an eye out for more thought-provoking content that brings history to life. Such a system normalized the commodification of women's bodies and perpetuated a culture of objectification and abuse. In contrast to the dowry paid by the bride's family, bride wealth involved the groom compensating the bride's family for the loss of her labor and services. While polygamy, having more than one spouse at a time, was generally reserved for men, Women were permitted to have multiple husbands, especially in upper classes. This custom not only undermined the sanctity of the marital bond, but also subjected women to exploitation and abuse. This payment was seen as a way to acknowledge the bride as value and ensure her proper care within the marriage. A girl's yes given under threat of violence or starvation was considered legally binding. This loophole allowed for the coercion of women into marriages without their genuine consent. It also provided a way for men to exploit and abuse women, all within the confines of a legal marriage. The absence of legal protection and societal support left them vulnerable and resigned to their fate. Priests would counsel wives to endure beatings and marital rape as penance for their inherent wickedness. This religious influence left women trapped in a cycle of abuse with little to no escape. The prevailing belief was that women should view marriage primarily as a duty and a means to secure economic stability. Encouraging affection and companionship was seen as a dangerous distraction from a woman's primary responsibilities. This financial exchange was intended to compensate the groom for taking on the responsibility of caring for a wife and often involved significant sums of money or property. While seemingly transactional, this custom reflected the economic importance placed on women in securing advantageous marriages. It also highlights the commodification of women's bodies, as they were essentially seen as commodities to be exchanged. The emphasis on fulfilling societal expectations rather than fostering genuine emotional connections resulted in countless marriages devoid of warmth and intimacy. The value of a woman in medieval society was measured primarily by her ability to bear male heirs, making her reproductive capabilities more important than her life itself. The relentless pressure to produce a male heir led to horrific practices such as trial marriages and the commodification of women's bodies. Men often treated their wives like disposable commodities, discarding them if they failed to produce a son. Forget the fairy tales because the reality was brutal, exploitative, and sometimes deadly. Join us on this journey through time as we explore the shocking truth behind medieval marriages. Before we delve into the dark secrets of medieval marriages, we humbly ask you to support our work with a thumbs up. Medieval marriages were far from the romantic unions we celebrate today. Welcome to my channel. And today let's explore the shocking truth of medieval marriages. The church played a significant role in perpetuating these brutal practices. One of the most disturbing aspects of medieval marriages was the virtual impossibility of divorce. Women who sought to end their marriages faced social stigma and were often branded as adulterers. The process of obtaining a divorce was incredibly difficult and expensive, requiring substantial evidence of wrongdoing by the spouse. Moreover, women who fled abusive marriages risked excommunication, effectively barring them from the church and severing ties with their community. Imagine being trapped in a loveless, abusive marriage with no hope for escape. That was the grim reality for many women during the Middle Ages. It's hard to comprehend the level of trauma and despair these women experienced day in and day out. The concept of companionate marriage, where spouses might find friendship, love, and mutual support was not just rare, but actively discouraged during the Middle Ages. It is disheartening to realize that something as fundamental as love and companionship was suppressed in the institution of marriage during this period. During the Middle Ages, the bride price or dowry paid by the bride as family to the groom or his family was common practice. This practice not only objectified women, but also placed a heavy financial burden on families, particularly if the bride's family couldn't afford a substantial dowry. According to medieval laws, a girl could be married with or without her consent, and her virginity was of utmost importance. These laws not only violated basic human rights, but also created an atmosphere of fear and oppression. In medieval times, the absence of a legal requirement for mutual consent in marriage was deeply troubling. This disturbing reality not only denied women agency over their own lives, but also subjected them to a lifetime of servitude. Although canon law technically required consent from both parties for a valid marriage, this consent could be coerced, purchased, or simply fabricated. Such a system not only violated the very essence of consent, but also perpetuated a culture of abuse and subjugation. During the medieval period, the power dynamics in marriage were heavily skewed in favor of men. This imbalance of power created an environment where men could exert dominance and control over their wives without fear of consequences. To understand the economic aspect of medieval marriage, it's essential to explore the concept of bride wealth. While intended to protect the bride's economic well-being, bride wealth also reinforced the idea that women were commodities to be bought and sold. One of the most shocking practices associated with medieval marriages was the availability of women for multiple marriages. The lack of exclusivity in marriage meant that women were exposed to the whims and desires of multiple partners without any say in the matter. The wedding ceremony itself was designed to reinforce the power dynamics inherent in medieval marriages. Even the exchange of rings held a significant meaning, serving as a reminder of the husband's ownership of his wife. If you've made it this far, you clearly share our fascination with history. By shedding light on these dark practices, we aim to raise awareness and spark conversations that challenge harmful societal norms. The medieval period shows us how far we've come, but also how vigilant we must remain to protect the progress that has been made. Looking at your script and the reference materials, I can see you recreating an engaging historical narrative about medieval wedding brutality. Here's part 3 of your 12-part script, continuing from where you left off. As we continue to peel back the layers of this barbaric practice, we're reminded of just how far we've come as a society. If you enjoyed this video, please don't hesitate to give it a like and share it with those who might find it equally fascinating. Your engagement helps us continue to bring these captivating stories to life. Should you wish to delve deeper into the annals of history with me, kindly subscribe to stay updated on our latest content. Once again, thank you for watching. I look forward to seeing you in our next captivating episode. Until then, stay curious and keep exploring the past. However, we must also acknowledge that the echoes of these dark traditions still resonate in our world today. The objectification and commodification of women's bodies, the prevalence of marital rape, and the struggle for reproductive rights are all issues that demand our attention and action. We must honor the bravery of those who fought for progress by remaining vigilant in the face of new challenges and ensuring that the hard-won battles for equality are not forgotten or reversed. The institution of marriage in medieval times was not merely a union between two people, but a complex web of legal, economic, and social arrangements that often trapped women in cycles of violence and subjugation. To understand the true brutality of medieval weddings, we must examine how these ceremonies served as the formal beginning of a woman's legal death. Under the doctrine of coverture, which dominated medieval legal systems across Europe, a married woman ceased to exist as a legal entity the moment she spoke her wedding vows. The very phrase to cover meant that a husband's legal identity completely absorbed his wife's. She could not own property, sign contracts, or even control her own wages if she worked. Everything she had been, everything she owned, and everything she would ever earn became his property as surely as his livestock or his land. This legal erasure was not some abstract concept confined to dusty law books. It had immediate and devastating consequences that began on the wedding day itself. Picture a young bride, perhaps only 13 or 14 years old, standing before a priest and formally surrendering not just her autonomy, but her very existence under the law. The wedding ceremony was essentially a transfer of ownership, with the bride as father handing over his property to her new husband in exchange for political alliance or financial gain. The wedding night itself was often the first manifestation of this complete legal powerlessness, with no concept of marital rape existing in medieval law. A husband could do whatever he pleased to his wife without fear of legal consequence. She had no right to refuse him, no right to seek help if he hurt her, and no right to leave if the situation became unbearable. The wedding bed became a place of terror for countless young women who had no understanding of what was about to happen to them. Medieval medical texts reveal the shocking ignorance surrounding women's bodies and sexuality. Physicians believed that women were simply defective men with reproductive organs that had failed to develop properly due to insufficient heat in the womb. This fundamental misunderstanding of female anatomy meant that the physical trauma experienced by young brides was often dismissed or ignored entirely. Pain during intercourse was considered normal, even desirable, as it was thought to help women conceive male children. The pressure to produce offspring, particularly male heirs, created another layer of brutality in medieval marriages. A woman's worth was measured almost entirely by her ability to bear sons who could inherit their father's property and titles. Those who failed to conceive quickly enough faced accusations of barrenness, which could lead to divorce, abandonment, or even accusations of witchcraft. The terror of infertility drove many women to consume dangerous potions and submit to painful medical procedures that often did more harm than good. Consider the case of Alianori of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the medieval period. Despite her immense wealth and political influence, she was still subject to the brutal realities of medieval marriage. Her first marriage to Louis VII of France was annulled partly because she had failed to produce a male heir after 15 years. She was immediately remarried to Henry II of England, demonstrating how even queens were valued primarily for their reproductive capacity rather than their individual worth or achievements. The physical dangers inherent in childbirth and the constant pressure to reproduce meant that motherhood was a risky and exhausting reality for medieval women. Child mortality rates were extremely high, and each pregnancy put a mother's life at risk through hemorrhage, infection, or the rare but dreaded male involvement. The lack of pain relief options and the prevalence of difficult deliveries made childbirth one of the most traumatic experiences imaginable. Yet women were generally expected to give birth without assistance, relying on the support of older children or servants while the father was away on business or crusade. Even for women of noble birth, royal palaces often lacked the necessary medical facilities and personnel to ensure safe deliveries, turning what should have been a moment of joy into a terrifying gamble for both mother and child. Women bore the brunt of these dangers, while men largely remained ignorant of the risks their wives and children faced. Marriage in medieval times was a legal contract between men, with women and children considered property, transferred from one man to another. This stark reality was reflected in the cryptic language of medieval wedding ceremonies. During the exchange of vows, the groom would declare, "I take you to be my wife," while the bride responded, "I take you to be my husband." These words masked the drastic shift in legal status that the bride was about to undergo. Stripped of her own name and identity, she would become known simply as the wife her existence, now completely defined by her relationship to her husband. The wedding ceremony itself often took on an air of menace and foreboding rather than celebration. For the bride, the solemn pronouncements of the priest warning her of the commitment and potential peril she was about to face underscored the gravity of the situation. As she stepped forward to meet her unknown fate, the medieval wedding was a rite of passage into a world of servitude, legal erasure, and physical danger for countless women. The very structure of the ceremony and the ominous words spoken by clergy served as a grim foreshadowing of the challenges and potential trauma that lay ahead. So there you have it, yet another medieval wedding tradition that seems straight out of a horror movie. Thank you for joining me on this journey through time as we explore the captivating and often unsettling history of our world. The institution of marriage has come a long way since the days of arranged child marriages and the Victorian ideal of women as fragile flowers who should be protected. But it hasn't come as far as we might hope. And in the Middle Ages, men straight up beat their wives with sticks of appropriate size. So buckle up for 5 shocking facts about marriage in medieval times that will make you glad you weren't born in that era. Medieval brides were often just children. It was not uncommon for girls to marry between the ages of 12 and 14, and sometimes even younger. You don't remember your wedding day because you were drunk and passed out. Childbirth in medieval times cannot be overstated without proper medical knowledge or sanitary conditions. Pregnancy and delivery were often death sentences. Maternal mortality rates were staggering, with some estimates suggesting that 1 in 4 women died in childbirth. Those who survived often faced years of repeated pregnancies that left their bodies broken and their health permanently compromised. Remember, this is happening to you in medieval times, so there's no birth control. Really bad medical conditions and religion plays a huge part in everyday life. In medieval times, this was seen as a normal and expected part of the marriage ceremony. While it may seem unimaginable in today's world, the brutal realities of the era reveal a stark contrast between then and now. However, by understanding and acknowledging the difficult circumstances faced by those in previous generations, we can work towards creating a better future where marriage is a partnership built on equality, respect, and love rather than one dictated by societal norms, religious doctrines, or economic interests. It was believed that sex was necessary to ensure that the bride lost her virginity and was deemed a proper, respectable woman. And if you didn't accept your husband's advances on your wedding night, you were seen as a bad and sinful girl. Obviously, this caused a lot of problems, especially when you consider the fact that most marriages were arranged and the couple had no say in the matter. Also, don't forget that you're just a child. It was widely believed that women were inferior to men and that they needed to be controlled. In fact, the Catholic Church taught that women were naturally sinful and needed the guidance of a strong man to keep them on the right path. Priests regularly preached that women were inferior to men and needed the firm guidance of male authority to keep them on the righteous path. They also said that women were more easily tempted by the devil and needed to be constantly supervised to prevent them from straying into sin. The story of Eve's temptation of Adam was used to justify treating all women as potential sources of corruption and evil, including their husbands. This religious justification for female subjugation extended far beyond the pulpit. Medieval art and literature consistently portrayed women as either pure, passive virgins or dangerous, sexually voracious temptresses. There was no middle ground that allowed for women to be seen as complex human beings with their own desires, ambitions, and capabilities. This cultural messaging reinforced the idea that women needed to be controlled and dominated for the good of society. The average noble woman might expect to be pregnant nearly continuously from her wedding day until menopause or death, whichever came first. That means that most women gave birth somewhere between 7 to 8 times during their lifetime. That's a lot of pregnancies. To put that in perspective, the average American woman today gives birth roughly 2 times in her lifetime. Back then, it was 7 to 8 times. And yes, miscarriages were common, but not everyone was as lucky. As those 8 pregnancies could span across 30 years, you'd probably end up spending a third of your life being pregnant, giving birth, or recovering from giving birth. Most medieval weddings involved heavy drinking and celebration, and you weren't of age to consent to anything. They had no friends to confide in, no family to protect them, and no legal recourse when their husbands abused them. Depression and madness were common among medieval wives, though these conditions were typically attributed to female weakness rather than the traumatic circumstances of their lives. So basically, if you survived all the pregnancies and didn't die, giving birth, you'd probably be mentally unstable because your husband just took you away from your home and now isolated, miserable, and alone in a place where nobody likes you and you can't leave. Congratulations, you're now a full-fledged adult in the eyes of the law, whether you feel like it or not. And to prove it, you get pregnant on your wedding night. Your body, which is still going through puberty, isn't ready for this, and neither are you. But again, in those days, it was considered normal and expected for young girls to get married and bear children at a young age. In fact, it was even encouraged because the more babies you have, the more workers you provide for your husband when he's too old to work. And the more granddaughters you have, the more potential brides your father has to make deals with. And forget those white dresses and bouquets of roses. The typical medieval wedding gown was a practical, long-lasting garment that could be reused for other occasions. Your days are spent helping your mother with household chores like cooking, cleaning, and taking care of younger siblings. You also help out on the family farm, working long hours in the fields alongside your father and brothers. There isn't much time for play or socializing. Marriage is something you hear about in passing. It's something that happens to other people, something that's inevitable for you in the future, but not something you think about too much. Life is hard, but it's simple. You know your place in the world and you know your role. Then one day, everything changes. A wealthy merchant from a nearby town has expressed interest in marrying one of your father's daughters. Your father, ever the pragmatist, sees this as an opportunity to improve his family as status and secure a better future for his children. He doesn't really ask your opinion because in those days, it wasn't really considered necessary to consult with his daughter about such things. Instead, he discusses the potential benefits of the match with your mother and older brothers, deciding ultimately that it's best for you. You are, after all, just a child. In fact, your whole life pretty much gets decided by men you're not even related to. The idea of a special dress for the wedding ceremony wasn't really popularized until the 19th century. Now, this might make you think of child brides today and how awful that practice is. And it absolutely is. But back then, this was considered a normal practice. At least in theory, because many times those girls would be married off before that age to someone completely unknown to them. To see what marriage was like in medieval times, imagine being a young girl living in a small village with your family. You get married at the ripe age of 12 and become pregnant almost immediately. Pregnancy in medieval times was rarely a walk in the park. The psychological toll of these marriages was equally devastating. Young women were torn from their families and sent to live among strangers who often viewed them with suspicion or hostility. And to add insult to injury, God himself says that you are inferior to your husband and that you must obey him in all things. This brings us back to that wedding night when you got drunk and passed out and your husband did whatever he wanted to you. Marriage in medieval times was an institution fraught with inequality, hardship, and abuse. Welcome back to my channel where we bring you new videos every week on all aspects of the fascinating past. Today, let's travel back in time to a period when love and marriage went hand in hand, and yet one was expected to tolerate the other. The legacy of medieval marriage brutality extends far beyond the Middle Ages themselves. The psychological scars left by these brutal marriage customs extended far beyond the individual women who endured them. The groom arrived with his male retinue, a boisterous crew of friends. She wore a veil not to enhance her beauty, but to obscure her face, transforming her into an anonymous object of patriarchal desire. She pledged to obey, to bear children, to serve, and to remain sexually faithful, while he promised to love, to cherish, and to protect. Men were considered superior to women, and their authority was absolute. The reception was often a continuation of the humiliation and degradation of the bride, and expectations that made him both perpetrator and beneficiary of the system of oppression. The legacy of medieval marriage customs lives on in the subtle and not so subtle ways that women are objectified, demeaned, and controlled in modern society. It lives on in the jokes that make light of domestic abuse, in the casual comments that question a woman's virtue, and in the laws that perpetuate gender inequality. To confront this legacy, we must first acknowledge it, to bring to light the darkness of the past, and to challenge the status quo that perpetuates gender-based violence and discrimination. Only then can we hope to create a future where women are valued not as possessions, but as human beings with agency, rights, and the freedom to define their own destinies. He, too, was expected to be brutal, dominant, and controlling, to assert his masculinity through violence and subjugation. His virility was measured by his ability to dominate his bride's body, to force her into sexual submission, and to prove his prowess as a male. The pressure to conform to these rigid gender roles was immense, and men who displayed any kindness or gentleness towards their brides were mocked and ridiculed by their peers. The brutality of medieval weddings was not simply a product of ignorance or superstition. It was a deliberate and conscious choice by a patriarchal society to maintain control and power over women. It was a system that relied on fear, humiliation, and pain to keep women in their subservient place. It was a system that treated women not as human beings with rights and dignity, but as objects to be bought, sold, and used. She was paraded around for the amusement of the male guests, who jeered and shouted obscenities. The bride's tears were seen as a sign of her submission and were encouraged, as they demonstrated her docility and willingness to accept her fate. Even the bride's female relatives and attendants joined in the mockery, pulling her hair, ripping her veil, and generally making a spectacle of her. It was a grotesque parody of the fairy tale wedding, a celebration of feminine misery and masculine dominance. Women's rights were limited to their role within the domestic sphere, and they were largely denied access to education, property ownership, and political participation. In fact, women were viewed as inferior beings whose very nature was to obey and serve. Medieval society believed that women were inherently deceitful and manipulative, and that they needed to be kept in check to prevent them from tempting men or disrupting the social order. This pervasive misogyny was reflected in the laws and customs of the time. For example, a wife could be imprisoned in her husband's home without trial or appeal, and she had no legal recourse if she was beaten or abused. Men, on the other hand, enjoyed far more freedoms and protections under the law. They could freely divorce their wives, provided they had legitimate reasons such as adultery or infertility. And they were not punished for beating their wives, unless, of course, they beat them to death. Such double standards were deeply ingrained in the fabric of medieval life, shaping the way men and women interacted and perpetuating a cycle of violence and oppression. Noticeably absent from both sets of vows was any mention of equality or partnership. Theirs was a transactional relationship, a legal contract that dictated the terms of their interaction. The medieval ideal was not a harmonious partnership, but a rigidly hierarchical one. The husband, the head of the household, held absolute authority, while the wife was relegated to the role of dutiful servant and childbearer. The consummation of the marriage was not a moment of intimacy and shared pleasure, but a right of possession and control. It was a stark reminder to the bride that she was now property, bought and paid for. Her body was no longer her own, but belonged to her husband and, by extension, to his family and society. If she resisted or did not comply, she was not merely shaming herself, but bringing disgrace upon her entire family. Resistance was futile and dangerous. The consequences of disobedience could be severe, ranging from beatings and starvation to banishment and accusations of witchcraft. Her submission was complete and unquestioning, a stark contrast to the fiery, independent women depicted in romantic tales such as those of King Arthur's knights. But the medieval world viewed women not as partners or equals, but as commodities, objects to be bartered, traded, and ultimately possessed. Her obedience was paramount. The bride's duty was to submit completely to her husband's authority, forsaking her own desires and needs in favor of his. This subservience was not just expected, it was drilled into her from childhood, preparing her for a lifetime of silent compliance. And relatives who had often caroused heavily on the way, eager to celebrate the upcoming nuptials with copious amounts of ale. While they waited for the bride, they engaged in raucous drinking games and contests of strength and skill, with the bride's father and brothers usually present to ensure that his daughter was wed to a man who could hold his liquor and throw a mean punch. Once the bride arrived, the celebration moved indoors where the real business of the wedding took place, not the joining of two hearts in love, but the transfer of property from father to husband and the subordination of daughter to family and crown. They shaped cultural attitudes about gender, power, and relationships that influenced literature, art, religion, and law for centuries to come. Many of the legal and social customs that emerged during this period continued to influence Western society for centuries afterward. The idea that women were naturally inferior to men and needed male protection and guidance persisted well into the modern era. The notion that marriage gave husbands unlimited rights over their wives' bodies and property remained embedded in legal systems until remarkably recent times. Understanding the true brutality of medieval weddings requires us to look beyond romantic notions of chivalry and courtly love to see the harsh realities that shaped women's lives. These were not merely different times with different customs, but a systematic form of oppression that caused immense suffering for countless individuals. Let's talk about why medieval weddings were so brutal. Part 4. This cycle of violence was passed down through generations, creating the foundation for the feudal system's oppressive hierarchy. The wedding ceremony itself was often the moment when a young woman's hopes for autonomy and happiness were formally crushed beneath the weight of social expectations and legal constraints. Now, as promised, let's take a closer look at what happened during the medieval wedding. The bride stood before the altar, a passive participant in a ritual designed to strip her of identity and autonomy. Even the vows themselves, meant to express mutual commitment, were a testament to this power imbalance. But why was such brutality considered acceptable? The answer lay in the prevailing social norms and legal traditions of the time. But the horrors of medieval weddings did not end with the ceremony. And what of the groom? He too was a product of his time, shaped by the same social norms. But why do we need to remember and understand this dark chapter in history? Because its effects are still felt today. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe if you want more videos like this. Thanks again, and see you next time. I'm here today to talk to you about my favorite topic, rape. Now, let me explain why I think this is such a critical issue. You see, women have been blamed for being raped. She is not allowed to speak, to express opinions, or make decisions. While the groom celebrated with other men, drinking and boasting about his new acquisition, the bride often sat in terrified silence, knowing that the evening would end with her first sexual encounter. What modern society recognizes as rape was not only legal within marriage, but expected and celebrated. The deflowering of the bride was seen as the husband's right and the completion of the transaction. Let's talk about rape within marriage. Once married, a woman had no right to say no to sex, no matter how many times her husband demanded it. Well, it's because we've been desensitized to the idea of marital rape. We've been taught that it's okay, that it's normal, that it's to be expected. And why is that? Because we live in a patriarchal society that teaches us that men have the right to do whatever they want with women's bodies. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to stay up to date on all of our latest content. Remember, rape is never the victim's fault. It's the rapist's fault. And we must do everything we can to create a world where rape is never glorified, normalized, or accepted. Thank you again for watching and take care. It's not about sex, it's about power. Men feel entitled to women's bodies because they're seen as inferior. Women are taught from a young age that they must be submissive and obedient. And if they resist, they're judged and punished. No matter how tired she was, no matter if she was menstruating, and she couldn't even demand protection if she didn't want to get pregnant. A woman's virginity is precious and must be protected. Men are raging beasts who can't control themselves. And if a woman dresses provocatively, she's asking for it. These myths are nothing but tools used to keep women under control. They're designed to make us believe that we're inferior, that we're objects, that we're someone's property. And the result is a world where rape is rampant and women are afraid to walk alone at night. I mean, come on. A woman's body became a battleground where her husband could claim victory whenever he wanted. It's the rapist's fault, and we must do everything we can to stop this cycle of abuse. That means teaching our sons that no means no, and that consent is essential. It means holding our daughters to higher standards, not to punish them, but to empower them. And it means creating a world where women are valued for more than their virginity, and where rape is never seen as acceptable. And if she resisted, she was labeled a shrew, a nagging, unfaithful bitch. And let's face it, no one wants to be called that. So a woman's best bet was to just give in and shut up. After all, if she didn't cooperate, she risked being called a bad girl, which was the worst insult of all. There was no expectation of gentleness, no consideration of the bride's feelings or desires. She was expected to submit to whatever her husband demanded, no matter how painful or degrading. In many cultures, proof of the bride as virginity was required with bloodied sheets, displayed as evidence that the husband had successfully claimed his property. If no blood was found, the bride could be accused of not being a virgin, leading to annulment, disgrace, and sometimes violence. This practice turned the wedding night into a performance of dominance and submission with the bride, S-Pain serving as entertainment for the wedding guests who might wait outside the chamber for proof of consummation, an event that was rarely consensual and often violent. The other women at the feast would regale her with horror stories of their own wedding nights, as if sharing trauma was some sort of twisted bonding ritual. What made these ceremonies particularly insidious was how they wrapped this systematic abuse in the language of celebration and divine blessing. The church taught that marriage was a sacred sacrament blessed by God himself. This religious sanctioning made resistance not just socially impossible, but spiritually dangerous. A woman who fought against her marriage wasn't just defying her father and husband. She was defying God himself, risking eternal damnation for the crime of wanting autonomy over her own life. Her compliance is total and unquestioning. Consider the words of the medieval marriage contract itself. The woman was required to vow obedience to her husband, not mutual respect or partnership, but absolute unquestioning obedience. Her property now belonged to her husband. Her children would bear his name, and even her body was no longer her own. She had become what legal scholars called a femme covert, a woman whose very existence was covered by her husband's legal identity. She could not own property. She could not make contracts. She could not even sue for divorce without her husband's permission. She was nothing more than a chattel, a thing, a piece of property belonging to her husband. She promised to be bonny and buxom in bed and at board, essentially vowing to be sexually available whenever her husband demanded and to serve his every need. The husband, meanwhile, made no such promises of obedience. His vows were about protection and provision, casting him as the benevolent master of a grateful servant. The symbolism of the ceremony was equally brutal. The bride was literally handed from one man to another, like property from father to husband. The wedding ring was not a symbol of mutual commitment, but a mark of ownership, much like the brand on cattle or the collar on a dog. In many regions, the groom would place the ring on each of the bride's fingers, in turn reciting in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Ghost, before finally settling it on the fourth finger. This ritual bound her to him through divine authority. But perhaps most disturbing was the public nature of these ceremonies. Designed to ensure there could be no escape, no claim that the marriage was invalid. Witnesses were required, not just to observe the happy couple, but to legally verify that the woman had been properly transferred to her new owner. The community became complicit in her enslavement, their presence serving as a legal guarantee that she could never claim the marriage was forced. They've been told it's their fault because they walked alone at night, because they wore provocative clothing, because they drank too much, or because they said yes too quickly. But until recently, we've never asked the most important question of all: why? Why do we allow ourselves to live in a culture where rape is so prevalent? And the answer is simple. We've been socialized to believe that rape is not wrong, that it's not even bad. In fact, we've been socialized to believe that it's good, that it should happen, that it's expected. And that's the point of this video. I want to explore how women are socialized to expect rape. Specifically, I want to examine the origins of this socialization. Where does it come from? How did we collectively decide that rape is good, that it should happen, that it's expected? And the answer will surprise you. It comes from our most cherished institutions, our most intimate rituals, and yes, even our most sacred ceremonies. Let's start with marriage. From the moment a woman is engaged, she is simply expected to comply. The wedding feast that followed was equally revealing of the brutal power dynamics at play. The wedding night itself deserves special attention for its ritualized brutality. The morning after the wedding brought no relief, only the beginning of a lifetime of sanctioned abuse. The new wife woke to find herself legally dead, but it gets worse. You might be thinking, why doesn't this sound like rape? And then there are the myths. Oh, the myths. We've all heard them. So the next time you hear someone say that a woman's fault she was raped, remember what I've told you. Rape is never the victim's fault. Thank you for watching this video. I hope it has given you a better understanding of the origins of the rape culture that surrounds us all. What if someone made you marry someone you don't know? Now imagine that you are a woman in medieval Europe. The first part took place at the altar where the bride and groom were announced as man and wife. She had to prove that she was a valuable asset, both sexually and reproductively. But the bride was not the only one being assessed. The groom had to demonstrate his virility and ability to perform. In many cultures, a bride price was paid to the bride's family by the groom's family. It was basically the price of buying a wife. You see, in the Middle Ages, it was crucial for a woman to be a virgin before marriage. If she wasn't, she could be killed. Believe it or not, there were even special tests to check if a woman was a virgin. The decision to marry was made by her father or guardian without considering her feelings or consent. And when it came to the wedding night, she was expected to comply with the consummation regardless of her emotional connection with the groom or any previous sexual experiences. It was a harsh and unjust reality for many women. While they may seem like a quaint and romantic part of history, they were actually a reflection of a much darker reality. The brutality and injustice inflicted upon women during these ceremonies is a stark reminder of the progress we still need to make towards gender equality. By understanding the true nature of medieval weddings, we can appreciate the strength and resilience of the women who endured them and work towards creating a world where such abuses of power never repeat themselves. They were trapped in a web of tradition and custom with no right to choose their partners or control their own bodies. It is a story that deserves to be told and remembered. so that we can honor the countless women who suffered under this oppressive system. If she didn't cooperate, she was labeled a shrew and ridiculed by society. To add to the injustice, she couldn't even seek justice in court because she was considered the property of her husband. The medieval system treated women as objects to be bought, sold, and used for men's pleasure and procreation. It's a dark and disturbing reality, but one that we must acknowledge and learn from. They were called the purity tests, and the two main ones were the wet and dry test and the comb test. The ceremony was supposed to be a celebration of love and commitment, but behind the beautiful rituals and traditions lay a system that objectified and oppressed women. It is a stark reminder of how easily religious beliefs can be manipulated to justify the most appalling practices. The wet and dry test involved inserting a finger or a cloth into the vagina to check if it was moist. If it was, she was considered impure. Can you believe that? The comb test was equally bizarre. It involved using a comb to pull the labia apart and check for any discharge. If there was any sign of sexual activity, the woman was considered impure and could be subjected to horrible punishments. These tests were not only humiliating, but also dangerous. They caused physical pain and emotional trauma, and let me tell you, it was not cheap. Others resorted to covering up their tracks by using herbs or douches. It was a desperate attempt to conform to the impossible standards set by society. But if a woman's virginity was questioned and the tests came out positive, she could be killed. It didn't matter if she was innocent or not. Society turned its back on her and she faced severe consequences. The amount could vary depending on the status and wealth of the families involved, but it usually included money, jewelry, land, or even livestock. Think of it like paying for a valuable item. The bride price was a way for the groom's family to show that they were serious about marrying the woman. And it was also a way for the bride's family to make sure that their daughter would be taken care of. It might sound weird to us today, but back then it was just how things were done. The witnesses of the consummation looked for signs of blood and other fluids on the sheets to confirm that the groom was indeed potent. If the groom failed to meet expectations, he would be mocked and ridiculed by the guests. And while this sounds like a dark joke, it was actually a very serious issue because doubts about his masculinity could lead to the annulment of the marriage. The bride, too, was judged by the witnesses. If she showed any sign of resisting the consummation, she would be labeled a shrew, a term used to describe a bad and difficult wife. And believe me, you did not want to be called a shrew. Being called a shrew could ruin the bride's reputation and make it difficult for her to find a new husband if she were ever to be rejected by her first one. This was followed by a feast where the bride and groom were paraded before the guests and then taken to their bedchambers. Well, the answer lies in the laws and customs of the time. Until the French Revolution in 1789, women were considered the property of their fathers or husbands. They could not own property, make contracts, or testify in court. They were essentially chattel, like livestock. Their consent didn't matter when it came to marriage. In fact, women could not consent to anything. Marriage was arranged by parents for various reasons, like uniting rival families, combining property, or making profitable alliances. The bride's opinion was irrelevant. Medieval laws considered a woman's primary duty to marry and bear children. If a woman didn't marry, she was seen as a failure, both by herself and by society. For men, staying single was not a problem. Marrying a virgin was more important for men than it was for women. Men could keep mistresses and their offspring were legitimate heirs. In the final part, the wedding night, the bride and groom were locked in a room together with only a candle and a loaf of bread for company. The consummation of the marriage was a necessary spectacle to ensure that the bride was a virgin and that the groom was capable of producing heirs. A successful consummation meant that the marriage was now validated by God Himself. and failure to produce heirs would result in an annulment. The bride and groom were expected to consummate the marriage on the wedding night, whether or not they liked each other. If the bride resisted, the groom could use force. If the groom was impotent, the bride could be forced to sleep with one of her husband's relatives or friends to produce heirs. If your father decided to betroth you to someone else, you would not be able to say no. Not only could not say no, but also you could not enter into contracts. You could not even file legal complaints against her husband, no matter what he did to her. The transition from daughter to wife was so complete and brutal that many medieval texts describe it as a kind of death and rebirth. The woman who had existed before marriage was considered to have died. She was replaced by an entirely new legal entity whose only purpose was to serve her husband's needs. Her maiden name was abandoned, her family ties severed, and her individual identity erased, so completely that she often lost even the right to be buried in her family's plot. For the families involved, these wedding ceremonies were business transactions dressed up as celebrations. The bride's family celebrated getting rid of a financial burden and securing political or economic advantages. The groom's family celebrated acquiring valuable property that would produce heirs and manage their household. The bride herself was rarely consulted about her feelings regarding any of this. Her emotions were considered irrelevant to the important business of male alliance building. The guests at these weddings understood exactly what they were witnessing. They weren't celebrating love or partnership. They were witnessing the legal transfer of human property and the beginning of what was essentially sanctioned slavery. The toasts and celebrations were for the men who had successfully negotiated the transaction, not for the woman whose life had just been destroyed. A common medieval wedding ceremony took place in 3 parts: the announcement, the banquet, and the consummation. To put it bluntly, the medieval wedding night was like a job interview for the bride. So you're probably wondering, why was the bride not allowed to say no to the marriage? Why couldn't she just run away? Now let's talk about something really uncomfortable: the bride price. Now let's delve into a topic that is both fascinating and disturbing: the virginity myth. The pressure to remain a virgin led many women to take extreme measures. Some of them used special underwear or devices to make their virginity tests look positive. Think about it, she was given no say in the matter. And what's fascinating is that this dark side of medieval weddings was hidden under a veil of religious sanctity. So the next time you hear about medieval weddings, remember that it wasn't just a fairy tale. In conclusion, medieval weddings were a complex mix of religion, tradition, and power dynamics. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to stay tuned for more insightful historical tales. For centuries, men have attempted to erase women's identities, to treat them as mere appendages existing only to fulfill male desires and societal obligations. This dark reality found its most chilling expression in medieval Europe, a period when the institution of marriage became a tool of oppression, stripping women of their autonomy and subjecting them to a lifetime of servitude. As we delve into the disturbing customs and laws that define medieval weddings, we'll uncover how this seemingly sacred bond became a brutal ritual of subjugation. It was during this ceremony that the bride officially became a prisoner, stripped of all rights and autonomy. Now alone with her captor, stripped of any hope of help or sympathy, she was subjected to the horrifying reality of her fate. For the rest of her life, the medieval bride would wake up each morning knowing that she was nothing more than a possession, a chattel to be used and abused by her owner. And should be viewed through a historical lens, doing so allows these atrocities to be committed against women throughout history. Even today, thousands of women around the world are forced into marriages they never consented to. Their lives are controlled by men they don't know, subjecting them to abuse, exploitation, and complete subjugation. They were the result of deliberate choices made by individuals and institutions seeking to maintain power and control over others. Many women actively resisted these atrocities, demonstrating remarkable courage and resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. It reminds us that behind the statistics and historical accounts are real people with hopes, dreams, and struggles. By listening to their stories and learning from their experiences, we develop a deeper understanding of the impact of these atrocities on individuals and communities. For example, the personal accounts of women who endured forced marriages during the medieval period provide invaluable insight into the emotional, psychological, and physical toll these practices took on their lives. Similarly, hearing the testimonies of survivors of honor killings or genital mutilation today allows us to better understand the devastating consequences of these practices on a human scale. By studying their stories and actions, we learn valuable lessons about the strength and tenacity of the human spirit in the fight for equality and justice. It allows us to see beyond the machinations of power and control and confront the real human cost of these practices. It challenges us to recognize the agency and resilience of those who resisted, and it inspires youth to continue the fight for gender equality and justice today. By centering the voices and experiences of victims, we can work towards a world where every individual is valued, respected, and free to make choices about their own body and future. For example, during the medieval period, some women resisted the constraints of marriage and societal expectations by becoming nuns, seeking refuge in the church. While their choices were often influenced by the limited options available to them, their actions still represent a form of defiance against a system that sought to confine them to domestic roles. Likewise, in modern times, women continue to push back against gender-based violence and discrimination through activism, legal advocacy, and community organizing. Their efforts are instrumental in challenging harmful traditions and driving positive change. By understanding the motivations behind these atrocities, we gain insight into the mechanisms of oppression and how they have evolved over time. For example, in medieval Europe, the subjugation of women was often justified through religious doctrine and patriarchal norms. Religious leaders and lawmakers weaponized interpretations of scriptures and local customs to create a system that enforced female subservience. They did this to maintain social order and ensure that women remained in subordinate roles. Similarly, in many contemporary contexts, women's rights violations are justified through religious or cultural beliefs. Understanding this deliberate manipulation of beliefs and traditions helps us expose the tactics used to perpetuate gender-based violence and discrimination. Viewing these practices as relics of the past absolves us of our responsibility to address the continued violation of women's rights and security. It lets us look away as women around the world are denied the most basic of human rights, the right to exist as autonomous beings with hopes, dreams, and futures of their own. We must confront the ugly realities of these traditions, understand their lasting impact, and work tirelessly to ensure that every girl grows up knowing that she is more than her marriage, that she is more than her captor, and that she is more than her pain. She had no rights, no voice, and no autonomy. Throughout history, different cultures and societies have enforced various forms of gender-based violence and restrictions on women's rights. It wasn't enough to understand these practices as isolated incidents in medieval Europe. We must recognize them as part of a continuous pattern of oppression and violence against women. Only then can we begin to dismantle the deeply rooted structures of inequality and discrimination that continue to marginalize and endanger women worldwide. Recognizing this global pattern is crucial in understanding why medieval weddings were so brutal. It wasn't just about European history. It was about the devaluation and objectification of women that has been normalized and justified across time and space. For instance, in many countries, women still face forced marriages, honor killings, and restricted access to education and healthcare. Similarly, in many communities, women have limited property rights, are subjected to domestic violence, and are denied equal opportunities. Every decision regarding her life, her body, and her future would be made by her husband and father, with her forced to comply absolutely. The medieval wedding wasn't just a ceremony, it was a brutal initiation into a life of captivity and subjugation. It was a stripping away of everything that made her a human being, a violation of her autonomy, her personhood, and her dignity. It was a statement of male dominance and female subservience. It was, in essence, a death sentence, killing the woman's spirit and extinguishing her hopes for happiness and freedom. She was now nothing more than property to be used and abused at will. There was no such thing as marital rape or spousal abuse. In fact, the very concept of abuse within marriage was alien to medieval thought. The bride had no rights, no recourse, and no value outside of her submission. If she resisted, she was punished, often beaten brutally. If she acquiesced, she was still violated, as her body was now owed to her husband regardless of her feelings. The wedding night wasn't about intimacy, love, or pleasure. It was about forcefully demonstrating who was in control and establishing dominance and possession. Her new life would be entirely dictated by her husband and father, who would effectively become her jailers. The wedding vows themselves were a declaration of the subjection. The bride was expected to pledge obedience to her new lord and master, promising to be his servant and do his bidding above all else in life. This wasn't a momentary commitment or a private exchange between two people in love. It was a public pronouncement witnessed by the entire community, turning the bride's subordination into a matter of civic record and male authority. These ceremonies weren't celebrations of love, but ritualized destructions of female autonomy. They weren't the beginning of partnerships, but the formalization of ownership. And they weren't blessed unions, but systematic human rights violations sanctioned by law, custom, and religion. The young girls forced into these marriages had no advocates, no escape routes, and no hope of rescue. They were sacrificed on the altar of male ambition and social control. Their lives destroyed before they had even truly begun. Their suffering was not incidental to the system, but essential to it. The visible demonstration that women existed solely for male benefit and that resistance to male authority would not be tolerated. As we examine these historical practices, we see how institutions that claim to protect and honor women actually serve to brutalize and control them. The medieval wedding was perhaps the most perfect expression of this hypocrisy, a ceremony that celebrated the destruction of a human being as autonomy while claiming to honor the sacred bond of marriage. It was brutality disguised as beauty, oppression wrapped in the language of love and slavery, sanctified by the church. To understand the gravity of this violation, let's start at the very beginning, the engagement. For medieval men, the engagement was less a time of joyful anticipation and more of a military campaign. A suitor would typically approach the girl's father, not to ask for his daughter's hand in marriage, but to demand it. Marriage was seen as a way to solidify alliances, transfer property, and continue one's bloodline, not as a means to unite two people in love. Once the engagement was forcibly established, the bride-to-be had no say in the matter. She was now a possession to be bartered, traded, and finally delivered. Her feelings, desires, and even her personhood were irrelevant. The wedding ceremony itself was where this crushing began, and for most women, it was where their hopes for happiness, freedom, or dignity died forever. But the degradation did not end with the vows. The wedding night was when the full brutality of the system came crashing down upon the bride. Beyond the wedding night, the horror persisted day after day. And while some may argue that these traditions were simply products of their time, medieval Europe was not unique in its treatment of women. To truly grasp the significance of medieval weddings, we must see them in the context of a larger historical narrative. Moreover, it's important to remember that these historical practices didn't emerge in a vacuum. It's also vital to acknowledge that these practices weren't imposed on passive bystanders. Finally, examining these historical practices through the experiences of those who lived them allows us to connect with the human element of these events. In conclusion, while it's essential to study history from multiple perspectives, adopting a victim-centered approach when examining atrocities like forced marriages during medieval times offers a powerful and necessary corrective. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe for more insightful historical content. What if I told you there was a time and place where being a woman was actually illegal? A place where just being born female meant that you were dead in the eyes of the law. Believe it or not, this wasn't a dystopian nightmare, but the everyday reality in medieval Europe between 900 and 1500 upon entering into wedlock. All of a woman's legal rights, including the right to own property, to make contracts, or even to testify in court, vanished into thin air. Her husband was her absolute master, and he could move her anywhere he pleased, regardless of her wishes or family ties. The marriage ceremony itself was a public pronouncement of a woman's subordination. The ring placed on the bride's finger was a visible sign that she now belonged to another man. It was no different from the brand placed on cattle or the collar placed on a dog. You wake up every morning knowing that every aspect of your life, from where you live to what you wear to who you can speak to, is controlled by a man. Your legal rights have vanished. Your property belongs to your husband. Your name has been taken away. Your identity has been rewritten. This wasn't just the legal system. It was a form of erasure, a silencing of women's voices, and a denial of their very existence as independent beings. A widow could regain some legal rights, but only under strict limitations. Being a woman in medieval Europe meant living in a constant state of vulnerability, always needing to be cautious of the actions, always needing to be careful of their words, always needing to be on guard against those who might seek to exploit or abuse their power. She might be entitled to a dower, typically 1/3 of her husband's estate. Their voices were silenced, their stories erased, and their contributions forgotten. It is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit that women throughout history have continually risen above. Please like, share, and subscribe for more historical tales. Until next time. Adversity pushing for a better world. A world where one day they will truly be equal. A world where being a woman is no longer a crime. For centuries, they fought for every inch of ground, facing hostility, scorn, and sometimes physical harm. Yet they persisted, driven by the innate human need for dignity, respect, and equality. How did medieval society, including the church, come to view women as less than human, as mere chattel to be bought, sold, and abused? This wasn't a fantasy or a dystopia. It was the lived reality of countless women in medieval Europe. They internalized these messages, these beliefs, these expectations, and they began to see themselves through the distorted lens that society had thrust upon them. The answer lies in a complex interplay of religious beliefs, cultural norms, and political expediency. Medieval theologians twisted biblical passages to fit their narrative of female subordination. Cultural norms that had long associated women with the devil and witchcraft amplified fears of female autonomy. And political leaders, eager to maintain control, manipulated religious sentiments to keep women in their place. But this was often challenged by his family members who viewed her as an outsider trying to claim what rightfully belonged to the bloodline. Many widows found themselves embroiled in lengthy legal battles, fighting for basic survival against hostile in-laws who wanted them gone. The circular shape wasn't meant to represent eternal love. It represented the unbreakable chain that now bound her to her husband's will. While medieval law provided some limited grounds for annulment, such as proving the marriage had never been consummated or that the parties were too closely related, divorce was virtually impossible. A woman who found herself trapped in an abusive marriage had no legal recourse. She could not leave, could not seek protection from the courts, and could not reclaim any of the property or independence she had surrendered at the altar. Any attempt to resist, to seek help, or to reclaim what was rightfully hers would be met with swift and severe consequences. Once adorned as a symbol of female beauty and love, the wedding ring was transformed into a stark reminder of a woman's loss of freedom in her transformation into private property. Records from the time show women being imprisoned, fined, or physically punished for attempting to conduct business without their husband's permission or for trying to reclaim property they had brought to a marriage. The legal system had no tolerance for women who forgot their place in the social hierarchy. The bride was required to explicitly promise obedience to her husband, and this vow had legal as well as spiritual implications. In a ceremony that symbolically enacted her complete absorption into her husband's identity, she took his surname, losing the last vestige of her individual identity. She was no longer Margaret, daughter of Thomas. She was now Margaret, wife of William. Her entire identity was redefined, solely defined by her relationship to a man. Even her given name, carefully chosen by her parents, was abandoned, replaced by a label that defined her as nothing more than an accessory to her husband. Imagine standing at the altar promising love and devotion, only to have that moment legally enshrine your subjugation. Every religious text was constantly quoted to remind women of their subordinate status. Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands, as unto the Lord. This wasn't just spiritual guidance. It was a legal mandate backed by the full force of both earthly and divine authority. The medieval church wielded its religious power to justify and enforce the brutal realities of a woman's legal death. She had no say in choosing her associates. He could forbid her from seeing friends or family members he disapproved of. She couldn't pursue a trade or profession without his permission. She couldn't even leave the house without his consent. The doors that had once opened to her now shut firmly against her, trapping her within the four walls of her home. No longer free to move, speak, or make decisions, she became a prisoner in her own gilded cage. These rights didn't become dormant or go up for negotiation. They were utterly revoked. In essence, a woman's legal existence ceased to be recognized the moment she married. All of it belonged to him as completely as his horse or his plow. This legal death, however, was not confined to the realm of property rights. It extended into every facet of a woman's daily existence. If you were a woman in medieval Europe, life wasn't merely difficult or unfair, it was outright illegal. In this dark period of history, being a woman meant existing in a state of perpetual second-class citizenship. The laws of the land legally dead, powerless, and entirely dependent on the whims of men. This wasn't simply a result of religious extremism or archaic cultural norms. It was a meticulously crafted legal system that stripped women of their rights, their property, and ultimately their very personhood. But how did this happen? What led to a time and place where being a woman was a crime and surviving as a female required constant vigilance and total submission? Join me as we unravel the chilling reality of medieval laws and discover how women were systematically stripped of their legal rights, reduced to objects and treated as second-class citizens in a society that criminalized their very existence. Our journey back to medieval Europe reveals a world where being a woman meant living under a cloud of legal death. A married woman could not choose where to live. To make matters worse, the church reinforced this legal erasure with religious doctrine that painted female submission as a divine commandment. Even the wedding ring, a symbol of love and commitment today, was in medieval times literally a symbol of ownership. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of this legal erasure was the stripping away of the bride's very name, the last vestige of her individual identity. Now, picture yourself as a woman in medieval Europe. The brutality of this system was further compounded by its permanence. Medieval courts were not known for their sympathy towards women asserting their rights. Perhaps the only shred of hope for some was widowhood, which might seem like a release from this legal death. But even widowhood brought its own restrictions. This wasn't just about denying women property or control over their lives. It was a systematic annihilation of their legal existence. But how did this happen? Imagine growing up in a world where you are told that your very nature is sinful, where you are taught that your desire for independence or knowledge is a threat. As a result, a woman's place in medieval Europe was not merely unequal or subservient. It was non-existent. The story of medieval women serves as a chilling reminder of the depths of human cruelty and the lengths to which societies will go to maintain control. Thank you for watching. The dark reality of the wedding night in medieval Europe, concealed within the veil of tradition. The facade of a joyous union shattered by tales of brutality, rape, and murder. A wedding was not just a celebration of love between two people, but a joining of two families and a reaffirmation of societal norms. However, this seemingly picturesque tradition held deep within it a culture of violence and oppression, particularly towards women. What we will reveal will challenge everything you thought you knew about the sanctity of matrimony. This custom, surprisingly common in many regions, involved the groom or his male companions sneaking into the bride's home and forcibly taking her away. Husbands had the right to beat their wives, a right that was considered absolute and without consequence. Women were denied basic rights. She had to endure the painful process of giving away her daughter, knowing that she would no longer be able to protect her. Shockingly, killing a bride on or near her wedding day was not uncommon. In some instances, this was done to prevent the consummation of the marriage. Medieval English weddings were a blend of Christian ceremony and old pagan customs. The wedding night was both a celebration and a rite of passage, marking the transition of a young woman into a married state and transferring her legal allegiance from her father to her husband. The groom and his male companions would arrive at the bride's home in a celebratory procession, often drinking heavily and making merry. The custom of bed delving, where the groom's friends would stand around the bed watching the consummation, added a layer of pressure and humiliation for the bride. It also involved other acts like the bridal loaf, where the groom placed a loaf of bread on his wife's lap and declared it his property. This symbolized the transfer of the bride as virginity to him and the loss of her status as a virgin. The bride now had to live with the consequences of her submission or resistance. If she complied, she was expected to bear children and produce heirs, often with little regard for her health or autonomy over her own body. If she resisted, she faced social disgrace and potential abandonment. If a bride resisted, she was seen as bringing shame to her family, and male relatives would often encourage or force her to accept the consummation. It also highlights the agency and resilience of women in the face of these norms, offering a glimpse into a past that is both disturbing and thought-provoking. The bride, usually under the watch of female relatives, would wait nervously. When she arrived at the wedding bed, the room was often filled with symbolic fertility objects like wheat, barley, and fruit. The groom's virility was emphasized, and the bride's compliance was expected. In others, it was a way to get rid of the bride who was seen as a nuisance or a threat. The bride's primary role was seen as that of a vessel for procreation, and her value was determined by her ability to bear children, especially sons. For men, this night was about establishing paternity and lineage. And for women, it was about fulfilling their perceived duty to produce heirs. Some brides took their vows seriously and refused to accept the consummation, leading to confrontations and sometimes even physical violence. In rare cases, brides might find support from their female relatives, who might intervene on their behalf or offer emotional support. But such acts of defiance were often met with social ostracism and were by no means guaranteed. Brides were sometimes poisoned by jealous relatives or even killed by their own fathers to avoid the stigma of having a daughter who was considered sexually impure. The lack of legal and social repercussions for such acts made bride murder a terrifying reality for countless women. In a society where women were seen as burdens and liabilities, getting married was often the only option for their survival. Families would use marriage as a means to secure economic stability or political alliances for their daughters. Even if it meant subjecting them to a life of abuse and servitude, they could not own property in their own name. All that a woman possessed, including her earnings, became the property of her father or husband. If a woman earned money through work, it was considered the property of her husband, whether she worked inside or outside the home. The dark history of medieval weddings reveals a world where women were not valued for their intrinsic worth, but rather seen as commodities to be traded, abused, and even murdered. It is a past that has had a lasting impact on our society, and a reminder that the fight for gender equality is far from over. Men were also granted the right to restrict their wives' movement. A wife was expected to live with her husband's family and was forbidden from leaving the house without her husband's permission. Any interaction with people outside was done so under the watchful eye of her husband. The consummation of the marriage on the wedding night was often a scene of terror and pain for the bride. Forcible rape on the wedding night was widespread and accepted. Grooms eager to prove their virility and establish paternity forced themselves onto their brides, disregarding any agency or consent. In many cases, the bride's pleas and tears went unheard as society turned a blind eye to the trauma inflicted upon her. The bride, often resisting, was then carried off to the church, sometimes literally dragged. Women were seen as possessions, chattel to be exchanged and used according to the whims of men. The bride had no say in choosing her partner. Marriages were arranged by families, often for reasons of consolidating power or wealth, with the bride's consent or happiness being of little importance. Once a woman was betrothed, she was essentially the property of her future husband, and the wedding ceremony was merely a legal formality that transferred this ownership. This traumatic start to the marriage was not seen as an aberration, but as a necessary evil to ensure that the bride fulfilled her duty to her family and society. It was believed that once a woman was taken, resistance would only bring shame to her and her family. Medieval European marriages were a blend of religious ceremony and legal transaction. One of the most disturbing aspects of medieval weddings was the routine practice of bride kidnapping. But the horror did not end at the doorstep of the church. This horrifying tradition was justified by the very structure of the patriarchal society that medieval Europe was. Medieval laws provided men with extraordinary powers over their wives. And it wasn't just the bride who suffered. Weddings were also a traumatic event for the mother of the bride. Perhaps the most extreme manifestation of this horrifying tradition was the prevalence of bride murder. These accounts may seem like relics of a distant barbaric past, but they are a stark reminder of the lengths to which misogyny and patriarchy can reach. Now let's explore the shocking truth about the wedding night in medieval England. While the specifics varied across time and location, the general principles remained consistent. But beneath the veneer of tradition lay a disturbing reality. For men, the wedding night was a display of power and virility, but this compliance was often coerced. In many cases, the wedding night was not just about sexual intercourse. Yet despite the horrors of the night, there were instances of resistance. What's more, the trauma didn't end with the wedding night. This dark history serves as a reminder of the lengths to which patriarchal norms can go and the toll they can take on individuals. If you want to know more about medieval life, stay tuned for more videos. Let's keep learning together. The wedding ceremony itself is perhaps the most insane example of how marriages in medieval Europe worked. I'm your host, and this is my channel. Today, we are going to look at what actually happened, During a medieval wedding ceremony, what happened during a wedding ceremony reveals the true nature of these transactions. The bride was given away by her father to her husband. She had no agency in the exchange whatsoever. She was not asked for her consent. While the groom celebrated with his male companions, drinking heavily and boasting of his conquest, the bride sat in virtual silence, often veiled and isolated from the revelry around her. They reduced one of the most significant milestones in a woman's life to a degrading spectacle, stripping her of her dignity and subjecting her to humiliation and potential trauma, all in the name of celebrating the transfer of her ownership. In some cases, the bride's family would pay a sum of money or provide gifts to the groom or his family. By treating women as commodities to be bought, sold, and exchanged, the medieval system stripped them of their individuality and subjected them to the whims of the patriarchal society that sought to control their lives and bodies. While in others, the groom would provide compensation to the bride's family for the loss of her labor and companionship. This grotesque intrusion into a deeply personal and private act reduced the bride to a mere object of male gratification and served as a reminder of her subjugated status within the marriage. The veil worn by the bride during the ceremony was sometimes retained during the consummation, symbolizing the shrouded secrecy expected of wives and the concealment of their sexuality from male gaze. However, it also added a layer of vulnerability and helplessness to the bride's image, emphasizing her diminished agency and control over her own body. These financial arrangements were negotiated entirely between men with detailed contracts specifying exactly what assets were being exchanged along with the woman herself. The bride's family had to pay a dowry to the groom's family, and the groom was expected to provide for his bride and her family financially. Women were viewed as a means to secure alliances, manage property, and ensure the continuation of bloodlines. Under this doctrine, a wife's legal identity was entirely dependent on her husband. She was considered a part of his household and could not act independently of him. Any property she owned became the property of her husband, and she had no rights to her own earnings or possessions. This transactional aspect of marriage led to women being treated as commodities rather than individuals. This disturbing practice was not only a testament to the medieval world's obsession with female purity. Under the doctrine of co-nature, a married woman ceased to exist as a legal entity. She could not own property, enter into contracts, or even control her own earnings. Her husband gained legal control over her body, her labor, and even her thoughts. Church doctrine taught that a wife's conscience was subsumed into her husband's moral authority. This legal erasure was so complete that married women could not even testify in court without their husband's permission, and their testimony was considered inherently unreliable due to their supposed weakness and susceptibility to error. Such accusations could result in brutal punishments, including beatings, and in extreme cases, death. It was a power-laden, anxiety-ridden experience marked by coercion, violation, and brutality. If you want to support the series and get early access to episodes, please go to our support page. Thank you for watching. This dark reality serves as a stark reminder of the deep-rooted misogyny and patriarchal control that permeated medieval society and the lasting impact it has had on perceptions of gender roles and power dynamics. The fear of such consequences created a climate of terror and ensured that women submitted to the demands of their husbands and the expectations of their society, but also a horrifying example of the lengths to which men would go to ensure a woman's compliance and enforce societal norms. It was a violation of the bride's privacy and autonomy and a shocking demonstration of the lack of respect for women's rights and bodily integrity. For instance, marriage contracts during the Middle Ages might include clauses specifying the amount of money or property to be exchanged, the bride's age and status, and even provisions regarding the bride's health, fertility, and physical condition. Some contracts even included bizarre provisions for returning the bride if she proved defective, unable to bear children, discovered to be unchaste, or suffering from undisclosed ailments. This commodification of women and reduction of marriage to a financial transaction highlight the transactional nature of the institution during the medieval period. It also shows the absence of women's voices and autonomy in these agreements, as they were essentially treated as bargaining chips in negotiations between families. She was displayed like a trophy, her beauty and supposed virtue offered as evidence of the groom's successful negotiation with her family. Marriage in medieval Europe was primarily viewed as an economic and political alliance between two families, rather than a union of two individuals based on love and mutual respect. The consummation of a marriage in medieval Europe carried with it a host of customs, beliefs, and expectations that serve as a chilling testament to the objectification and mistreatment of women during that era. The act of sexual intercourse between a newly married couple was not merely a private and intimate moment. It was a public spectacle, a ritualistic affirmation of the woman's transition into her new role as a submissive and obedient wife. This perspective was deeply ingrained in the culture and was supported by religious doctrine, which taught that marriage was ordained by God as a means to procreate and maintain social order. Consequently, the marriage contract was a formal legal document that outlined the terms of the agreement between the families of the bride and groom, and it served as a binding contract that both parties were expected to uphold. The guests would make crude jokes about the wedding night to come, treating the bride as impending sexual initiation as entertainment rather than acknowledging her as a human being with feelings and fears. These celebrations often included disturbing rituals designed to publicly mark the transfer of sexual ownership. In some regions, wedding guests would follow the couple to their bedchamber, making lewd comments and sometimes even remaining to witness the consummation. The bride's terror and humiliation were considered not just acceptable, but amusing to the wedding party. Her tears were dismissed as maidenly shyness rather than genuine distress at what was essentially legalized sexual assault. During the ceremony, she was spoken about in the third person as if she were an object incapable of speech or thought. "Take this woman, she is now yours." The wedding vows themselves reinforced this dehumanization. The bride promised to love, honor, and obey, while the groom was only required to love and cherish. A telling of symmetry that reflected the fundamental inequality built into the institution. Wedding traditions further reinforced women's status as property. One tradition was the placement of the wedding ring on the fourth finger of the left hand. Medieval people believed a vein ran directly from that finger to the heart. This belief, rooted in ancient Greek and Roman ideas, symbolized the husband's dominance over his wife's very life force through this special anatomical connection. This belief in a special connection between the fourth finger and the heart actually goes back much further than the Romans. It's found among various cultures around the world, suggesting that this idea may reflect a deep-seated cultural bias towards objectifying women's bodies and reducing them to mere instruments of male pleasure. Another tradition was the act of carrying the bride over the threshold. This custom originated from Roman times when it was seen as a way to prevent the bride from tripping as she entered her new home. Tripping would have been considered a bad omen for the household's prosperity, but by the medieval period, this protective gesture took on darker connotations. The groom literally carried his new possession into his domain, emphasizing her complete dependence on his will. This public display of female submission was a stark reminder of the bride's lack of autonomy and the reality that she was now the property of her husband. Then there was the wedding feast that followed the ceremony. The grotesque and disturbing aspects of these wedding traditions vividly illustrate the medieval world as acceptance of treating women as objects devoid of rights or autonomy. In addition to these customs, the actual marriage contract or agreement between the two families provided a clear picture of the transactional nature of medieval marriage. The bride price, or dowry, as it was commonly known, involved a transfer of property or money from one family to the other upon the marriage of their child. These economic aspects of marriage further reinforced women's subordinate status and the fealty owed to male authority. What happened during the consummation of the marriage is something many people don't know about, and it really helps to shed light on what women went through during this time period. As noted earlier, some wedding celebrations included following the couple to their bedchamber, making lewd comments, and in some instances, remaining to witness the consummation itself. In some regions, the consummation was accompanied by a ritual known as the bed test, where the bride's virginity was supposedly tested by examining her bedding for signs of blood or other bodily fluids after the act. To make matters worse, if the bride resisted or did not cooperate during the consummation, she was often accused of being a deceptive, unfaithful, or even a witch. The consummation of marriage during the Middle Ages was far from a sacred and intimate bond between two consenting adults. One important thing to note is that medieval marriage was not just about the relationship between the bride and groom. It was a transaction involving two families. This treatment of women continued into the legal system of the time. Women's subordination was also evident in the legal concept of femme covert. I hope you enjoyed this episode with a special thanks to my patrons. Marriage is supposed to be a sacred bond between two people in love. It is a union based on mutual respect, trust, and shared affection. But have you ever stopped to think about what the history of marriage is? What are the dark secrets behind this sacred institution? Get ready to challenge everything you thought you knew about marriage and its impact on society. So, without further ado, let's dive into the dark history of marriage and its evolution from a sacred bond to an institution of power, control, and oppression. Let's explore the depths of this dark institution. In the medieval period, women were considered intellectually and morally weak creatures, incapable of making significant decisions for themselves. Medieval marriage customs included numerous rituals designed to break a woman's spirit and ensure her complete submission. One such custom was the practice of public humiliation. From the very beginning of the marriage, the husband was expected to establish his dominance over his wife. It was not only legal, but actively encouraged as a necessary tool for maintaining household order. Their subordination was not just ideological, but deeply ingrained in the fabric of society. The consequences of this system were devastating for women. They were trapped in a cycle of abuse and oppression, with little to no means of escape. Your only crime, asserting your existence. This was the reality for many women in medieval marriages. They were deeply ingrained in the social, legal, and religious norms of the time. Marriage wasn't just a bond of love and companionship. It was an institution designed to maintain social order and male dominance. The rituals, laws, and expectations surrounding marriage all worked together to create a system that subjugated women and denied them basic human rights and dignity. The constant threat of violence hung over every aspect of married life, reminding women of their inferior status and the risks of disobedience. By understanding the struggles and injustices faced by women throughout history, we can appreciate the progress that has been made and continue striving for a more equitable and compassionate world for all. Remember, knowledge is power, and with it comes the responsibility to create positive change. So keep learning, keep challenging the status quo, and keep working towards a brighter future. Together, we can honor the past and build a better tomorrow. Husbands had the legal right to confine, beat, and even kill their wives under certain circumstances, such as if they were deemed unfaithful or disobedient. This absolute power over their wives' lives, and even deaths, instilled a culture of fear and obedience. Women who attempted to flee abusive marriages faced a perilous journey fraught with obstacles. Not only were they socially stigmatized and ostracized, but also risk severe legal repercussions. The church played a significant role in upholding this system, often siding with the husbands and labeling the wives as sinful or deceitful. This religious backing gave men greater justification and latitude to mistreat their wives, turning the spiritual institution of marriage into a tool for earthly dominance and control. The lack of legal and social protections left them vulnerable to the whims of their husbands and male society. It was a far cry from the romantic notion of marriage as a loving bond between equals. Medieval law specified the appropriate size of stick a husband could use to beat his wife, famously giving rise to the phrase rule of thumb, highlighting the acceptance and normalization of domestic violence against women. New wives were deliberately isolated from their birth families and childhood friends, severing their ties to the outside world and creating complete dependence on their husband's goodwill. This isolation ensured that the wife had no one else to turn to for help or support, leaving her utterly dependent on her husband. Additionally, they were forbidden from learning to read or write in many households, keeping them ignorant and unable to communicate with the outside world. This ignorance made it difficult for them to understand their rights or seek help from authorities, further entrenching their subordinate position. Furthermore, their movements were strictly controlled, with many women literally locked in their homes when their husbands were away. This confinement was not merely a restriction of movement, but a means to reinforce the idea that the wife's place was in the domestic sphere, and that she was not allowed to venture out or assert her independence. The church also supported these practices, teaching that a husband who failed to physically discipline his wife was neglecting his Christian duty. This created a climate where violence against wives was justified and even expected, leaving women vulnerable to physical abuse within the sanctity of their own homes. He did this through various acts of public humiliation, making sure that she was aware of her subservient position. For example, he might publicly criticize her actions or force her to apologize for minor offenses. These acts of humiliation were not only meant to assert the husband's authority, but also to degrade the wife and break her resistance. They were viewed as possessions belonging to their fathers or husbands, existing solely to serve male interests. While not technically legal, wife-feeling was widely tolerated and even formalized in some communities. This practice gave men the right to purchase their partners from their husbands, essentially treating wives as commodities to be traded. This custom stripped women of their dignity and autonomy, reducing them to objects that could be bought and sold at will. The casual manner in which wives were exchanged, often in the public marketplace alongside livestock and household goods, emphasized their low status and the commodification of their bodies. The sales were conducted with the same ceremonial procedures as other commercial transactions, complete with bills of sale and public announcements, further emphasizing the transactional nature of marriage. This perception reduced women to mere objects devoid of agency or autonomy. As a result, they were denied basic rights and freedoms. For instance, they could not make wills, meaning that upon their death, their property would be transferred according to the wishes of their male relatives. Similarly, they could not buy or sell goods without male authorization, effectively barring them from engaging in any form of economic activity. Moreover, they could not even seek medical treatment without a male's permission, highlighting the extent to which women's bodies were subject to male control. In essence, marriage transformed women from limited legal persons into non-entities existing only as extensions of their husband's will. Welcome to our channel, where we uncover the hidden and sometimes disturbing realities of the past. Imagine a time when marriage wasn't about love, but rather a transaction, a way to transfer property and secure alliances. That was medieval Europe, and the customs surrounding marriage were far from romantic. Women were seen as property, and the wedding ceremony was like a ritual of conquest. The bride was treated like a prize to be claimed by the groom. Now picture this, you're the bride and your wedding night is approaching. You're not nervous or excited, you're terrified. Because for you, the wedding night isn't about romance. It's about submission. You're expected to submit not just to your husband, but to a whole system that sees you as less than human, as chattel to be bought, sold, or beaten at will. The veil covering your face isn't to hide your identity. It's to conceal your tears and fear. This wasn't uncommon in medieval Europe. It was the norm. Today, we delve into the dark side of marriage, exploring the ways in which it has been used throughout history as a tool for power, control, and oppression, particularly against women. The horrors of medieval marriage customs, specifically those involving women, still persist in our collective memory. But why? Why was marriage such a terrifying prospect for women? The violence inherent in this system extended far beyond the wedding night itself. Another disturbing custom was the practice of wife-ealing, where a wife could be auctioned off by her husband to another man. Wife-beating, too, was another distressing aspect of medieval marriage customs. All of these customs combined to create a system where women were not viewed as equal partners, but rather as possessions to be controlled and dominated. Medieval marriage customs went beyond brute force. There was a calculated psychological warfare at play. Now imagine the trauma of being trapped in a room day after day with nothing but your thoughts and the four walls around you for company. It's crucial to understand that these practices were not aberrations or the actions of a few isolated individuals. We must acknowledge and learn from the dark aspects of history so that we can work towards a better future. Do you find these topics interesting? Let us know in the comments. Please like and share for more such videos. Imagine being forced to marry someone you've never met, handed over to them like a prized possession while onlookers cheer and celebrate. The horror doesn't end there. What if the very next day, your new spouse publicly denounces you as a bad girl? They were a full-blown public ritual that marked the death of a woman, this individual identity and her rebirth as her husband's property. They were a traumatic experience designed to break a woman's spirit and bend her to her husband's will. As the bride stood before the altar, she didn't just exchange vows with her soon-to-be husband. Immediately following the ceremony, the groom and his groomsmen would drag the bride away to a separate room, often locking her inside for days. After the bride was finally allowed to rejoin the festivities, she was paraded around once again, this time dressed in the ugliest clothes imaginable. Her hair was cut off, her eyebrows shaved, and she was forced to wear a veil over her face. Some brides refused to accept their fate passively. Accounts exist of women fighting back against their abusers, biting, scratching, and clawing at their attackers. These acts of defiance, though often met with even harsher punishments, demonstrate the indomitable spirit of women who refuse to surrender their humanity, even in the face of unimaginable brutality. How would you react to being publicly humiliated and abused by your new spouse? Let us know your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe for more videos on medieval misogyny and other historical topics. Until next time, stay strong, stay educated, and keep fighting for a better, more equitable future for all women. But such acts of resistance were the exception, not the rule. Part 8, where we explore even more disturbing aspects of medieval life. Click here to continue your journey through history and uncover more secrets from the past. Don't miss out. Keep exploring and expanding your knowledge. For the most part, the brutality of medieval weddings went unquestioned. This grotesque display wasn't meant to honor or celebrate the bride, but to degrade and humiliate her. In a world where women were seen as inferior to men and had few rights or protections, these brutal customs were considered acceptable. The truly disturbing aspect of this dark history is that it wasn't uncommon for young girls to be married off against their will, sometimes to strangers many years their senior. To make matters worse, the bride's own father would participate in the horrific proceedings, handing his daughter over to her abuser and cheering as she was humiliated. Such callousness toward the emotional well-being of women was deeply ingrained in medieval culture. By stripping her of her beauty and covering her face, the groom and his guests were essentially proclaiming that the bride was no longer her own person, but a possession to be admired only from a distance. Joy, celebration, commitment to your partner. Now imagine the opposite: humiliation, degradation, loss of identity. That's what medieval weddings were like for many women. These ceremonies weren't just about uniting two people in marriage. They were about asserting male dominance and enforcing strict gender roles. By understanding the dark history behind traditional wedding practices, we can better appreciate the progress women have made toward equality. It's important to remember that the horrors of the past serve as a reminder of how far we've come and how much work still needs to be done to ensure that every bride walks down the aisle knowing that she is not just a possession to be exchanged, but a human being deserving of love, respect, and autonomy. The purpose of this solitary confinement was twofold. First, it served as a punishment, a form of torture designed to break the bride's spirit and force her submission. The bride's humiliation and subjugation were not just tolerated, but celebrated because they reinforced the hierarchy that society was built upon. Women were seen as inferior to men, and their role was to serve their husbands and obey his every command. By turning the wedding ceremony into a spectacle of female subordination, the medieval world affirmed its values and sent a clear message to all women: your place is at home, submitting to your husband's authority. There was no room for love or equality in this archaic ritual. Second, it was a display of power, a reminder that the bride was now under the complete control of her husband. She was hidden away not because anyone cared for her well-being, but to assert dominance and maintain control. The isolation was meant to be as terrifying as the groom and his friends reveling in their newfound power over the helpless bride. She was subjected to a public shaming orchestrated by the groom. He would loudly denounce her as a bad girl, highlighting her supposed transgressions and emphasizing that she must be punished. This humiliating spectacle wasn't intended to make the bride feel loved or cherished. It was a brutal reminder that she was now on display for all to see, and her every move would be scrutinized. By subjecting her to public ridicule, the groom asserted dominance from the very start. It was a show of power meant to instill fear and obedience in the young bride. It all began with the bride's entrance into the ceremony. She was paraded through the streets, often carried shoulder high by her father and attendants. But instead of celebrating her upcoming marriage, this humiliating display served to emphasize her loss of status and freedom. Her value was reduced to that of a prized possession being transferred from one man as ownership to another. This degrading procession didn't just set the tone for the ceremony. It foreshadowed the bride's new life as a subjugated wife. She was literally being shown off like a trophy. But what made these ceremonies so horrifyingly brutal? How did they traumatize brides and solidify the foundations of medieval patriarchy? Join us as we pull back the veil on the dark side of medieval weddings. And punishes you by cutting off your hair, shaving your eyebrows, and covering your face with a veil. Welcome to the terrifying reality of medieval weddings. This isn't some dystopian nightmare, it's history. And it's time to expose the dark secrets behind the seemingly innocent tradition of walking down the aisle. In the medieval period, weddings weren't just about saying, "I do" before God and one's partner. While we might think of weddings today as a joyous occasion filled with love, laughter, and commitment, medieval nuptials were anything but merry. But the true horror of medieval weddings was reserved for the ceremony itself. And the torture didn't stop there. But perhaps the most disturbing custom of all was the public humiliation and physical punishment that took place during the wedding feast. So why did this barbaric tradition continue for centuries? Medieval weddings were brutal because they were designed to enforce a rigid social order. However, amidst the darkness of medieval traditions, there were rare glimmers of resistance. Medieval weddings were a horrific display of misogyny, but they were also a reflection of the times. When you think of your wedding day, what comes to mind? Do you think you could have survived a medieval wedding? Let's move on to the next shocking truth about the Middle Ages. In modern times, we look back at the institution of medieval marriage and shake our heads in disbelief. The idea that a woman could be bought and sold like property or forced into a lifelong union with a man she may have never met is appalling to us. But during the Middle Ages, this wasn't just commonplace, it was considered a sacred duty ordained by God himself. It was a time when the sanctity of marriage was paramount, where every aspect of a woman's life was dictated by the rigid rules of the church and state. She would abandon her old life, leaving behind her home, her belongings, and most importantly, her family. This transition was more than a change of residence. It was a symbolic death and rebirth. Since married women could not own property or enter contracts, they had no means of achieving economic independence. Women were expected to risk their lives repeatedly bearing children with no say in the timing or number of pregnancies. This lack of bodily autonomy meant that women had no control over their own fertility or the well-being of their children. Husbands could demand children whenever they wished, regardless of the wife's health or other obligations. Every action was heavily scrutinized, and every misstep could lead to severe consequences. However, there were rare exceptions. Some women, driven by an unquenchable thirst for knowledge or compelled by divine inspiration, managed to break free from these constraints and made significant contributions to various fields. Think of Hildegard von Bingen, a polymath who excelled in theology, medicine, natural science, and art. Or Christine de Pizan, a prolific writer who challenged prevailing views on women's roles and capabilities. Despite facing societal opposition, these remarkable women illuminated the potential that existed, even in the darkest of times. This wasn't merely a relationship based on love and mutual respect. It was a battleground of wills where the odds were heavily stacked against women. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support means everything to us. Also, do share your feedback in the comments section. We love hearing from you guys, and we'll see you in the next one. Now imagine living your life under such oppressive conditions, where every move is watched, every word is measured, and every choice is dictated by men. That was the reality for countless women during the Middle Ages. Their lives were not their own, but were instead pawns in a game of religious and societal control. This demand for procreation turned the wife's womb into a commodity for producing heirs, a means to an end rather than a site of personal growth and development. A woman whose husband died might find herself completely destitute if he had chosen to leave his property to someone else, which the law permitted him to do. Once married, women were expected to remain within their husband's household, venturing out only with permission and usually under supervision. This confinement was not merely a matter of custom, it was a way to ensure obedience and prevent women from seeking help if they needed it. The intention was to keep the wife dependent on her husband, both physically and emotionally. This isolation made it difficult for women to develop social networks outside the household, leaving them with little or no support system in case of conflict or need. The expectation was that a woman's loyalty should be absolute, belonging to her husband and his family first and foremost. Maintaining close relationships with her birth family or female friends was often viewed as a form of betrayal. The ideal medieval wife was one who put the needs of her husband and his household above all others, including her own family. This meant that women were not only giving up their independence, but also severing important emotional ties. Widows often discovered that homes they had lived in for decades, businesses they had helped build, possessions they had brought to the marriage. None of it belonged to them. This was the reality for many medieval women. They were trapped in a cycle of dependence and isolation with no way out. Medieval marriage contracts sometimes included specific provisions about punishment, outlining in clinical detail exactly how wives could be disciplined for various infractions. These provisions were not mere guidelines. They were explicit instructions for husbands on how to maintain control and punish their wives for any perceived disobedience or wrongdoing. For instance, a wife who spoke to a man other than her husband, engaged in gossip, or failed to prepare meals on time could be subjected to beatings or other forms of physical punishment. These punishments were not considered excessive, but were seen as necessary to maintain order and obedience in the household. The concept of marital discipline wasn't limited to physical abuse. A wife's disobedience could also result in sexual penalties. Husbands had the right to withhold sex as a form of punishment, a tactic to control his wife's behavior. This form of abuse was considered acceptable and even encouraged, with some clergy members advising husbands to use withholding sex as a means of correcting their wife as perceived faults. They could be turned out into the street with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Even women's reproductive capacity was considered their husband's property. Medieval law granted husbands absolute sexual access to their wives' bodies. The concept of marital rape simply didn't exist because a wife's body belonged entirely to her husband. She had no right to refuse sexual demands, no matter how violent or degrading. The woman shed her former identity and took on the role of a submissive wife, bound to her husband's household. The vows that bound a man and woman together went beyond love and commitment. This wasn't based on personal feelings, but on religious doctrine and scientific theory. It was believed that women were inherently prone to sin, weakness, and rebellion against rightful male authority. Women were described as the devil's gateway creatures whose very nature required constant supervision and correction by their moral superiors, their husbands. St. Thomas Aquinas, one of the most influential theologians of the medieval period, wrote extensively about women's natural inferiority. He argued that they were defective and misbegotten creatures, incomplete versions of the male form. This wasn't considered misogynistic rhetoric. It was accepted scientific and theological fact taught in universities and preached from pulpits across Europe. They were a matter of life and death, obedience and damnation. For example, the Apostle Paul's writings in the New Testament were often cited to support the notion of female subordination. In 1 Corinthians, Paul states that women should have a head covering while praying or prophesying. This passage was interpreted as a command for women to submit to male authority. Similarly, Paul's advice to wives to be submissive to their husbands was taken as a divine mandate for women to accept their subordinate position. These biblical passages, along with teachings from church fathers like St. John Chrysostom, formed the theological basis for the subjugation of women. Welcome to my channel, and today, let's find out how much medieval marriages sucked for women. Medieval marriage was not merely a union between two people, but a transaction between two families. Marriages were arranged for political alliances, economic gain, or to consolidate power. Love had little to do with it. In fact, many women were married off without ever meeting their future husband. The bride price, known as the bride's bed, was a substantial sum of money or property paid by the woman's family to the groom's family upon their marriage. This hefty payment was seen as compensation for the loss of the daughter, as services, and reflected the value society placed on women as property. Once the bride price was paid, the woman's family had fulfilled their obligation and had no further responsibility for her welfare. The bride, usually in her teens, had little say in the selection of her partner. Her parents, acting in her best interests, would choose a husband they deemed suitable. If a woman did voice her opinion, she was expected to be obedient and accept the man her parents chose. If she refused, she ran the risk of being branded a shrew and subjected to further restrictions on her behavior. And if she continued to resist, she might be locked in a tower, literally thrown into a dungeon, kept there until she agreed to marry. Once the marriage contract was signed, the woman was expected to move in with her husband and his family, severing ties with her own. Medieval women were viewed as naturally inferior to men. Women's subordination wasn't just legally mandated, it was portrayed as a fundamental law of nature and divine will. The economic dimensions of this oppression were equally devastating. Pregnancy and childbirth, already extraordinarily dangerous in an age without medical care, became additional tools of control. The isolation that accompanied medieval marriage was perhaps the cruelest aspect of all. Imagine being confined to four walls, cut off from the world you once knew, unable to reach out for help or comfort. In essence, medieval marriage was a high-stakes game for women. During the Middle Ages, a woman's place was firmly entrenched in the domestic sphere, leaving little room for education or intellectual pursuits. Their stories serve as a reminder that the suppression of women's education and rights was not absolute and that extraordinary. Individuals can emerge even in the most restrictive environments. The worst parts of medieval marriage aren't commonly known because we don't think like that anymore. We tend to think of marriage as a union of two people in love, a partnership or a bond of family. But that's not what marriage was in the Middle Ages and Resistance, reminding us that even in the darkest times, the human spirit perseveres. It was brutal, dehumanizing, and utterly without romantic love. But there was a lot more going on in the medieval economy than that. From royal castles to simple farmhouses, medieval life revolved around the careful management of resources and labor. Let's start with the basics. The land was owned by the king, who granted sections of it to nobles in exchange for loyalty and military service. These nobles, in turn, divided the land among lesser nobles and peasants. This system created a complex web of obligations and payments. Peasants paid rent to nobles in the form of crops or money, while nobles sent portions of their own rents to the king. This arrangement wasn't just a way to manage land, it was a way to maintain power. By controlling the means of production, the landowners controlled the wealth and thus the ability to govern. But this economic system didn't exist in a vacuum. It was surrounded by laws, customs, and beliefs that shaped how people worked and how much they earned. For instance, the value of work was determined by custom rather than free market forces. What a job was worth was decided by tradition and often by powerful guilds that sought to maintain high standards and limit competition. This meant that workers had little say in their wages, and employers could set rates based on what they thought was fair, not necessarily what was sustainable for their workers. Additionally, poverty was viewed differently in the Middle Ages. While today we might see poverty as a result of economic factors, during the medieval period, poverty was often seen as a moral failing. The poor were believed to be lazy, unskilled, or otherwise undeserving of prosperity. This attitude led to limited government aid and a heavy reliance on charity, which was often given with the expectation of obedience or servitude. In a world where work was arduous and the value of labor was dictated by tradition, the economic landscape of medieval Europe left little room for advancement or fair compensation. The gap between the wealthy landowners and the working class was vast, and the lack of individual bargaining power meant that those doing the work often struggled to make ends meet. When Christian kingdoms began taking shape across Europe, rulers and religious leaders alike used marriage to consolidate power, wealth, and social order. And they did this with the full force of the law. Men entered marriage knowing that they were becoming legal gods, holding the absolute power of life and death over their wives' lives. Women entered marriage knowing that they were becoming legally dead, having no rights or autonomy of their own. In fact, these extreme standards were considered the norm, the expected standard. Women entering a marriage had to know that their husbands were legally empowered to beat them, starve them, or even kill them at will. No man would dream of marrying a woman who didn't submit completely, and any who did were considered dangerously out of control. So if a woman did not submit, she would likely be beaten until she did. And she couldn't even call her husband's behavior into question. Women simply weren't allowed to do that. They couldn't press charges against their husbands. They couldn't go to court, and they couldn't even complain to the priest. Theological doctrine held that a wife was obligated to obey her husband regardless of his whims or demands. The clergy taught that a good wife fulfilled her role by accepting her fate without complaint. Men, on the other hand, were encouraged to enforce obedience through whatever means necessary. The goal of marriage, from the groom's perspective, was to possess his bride's body. Men boasted openly about dominating their wives, forcing them into submission, breaking their wills, bending them to his desires. Extreme though they were, these attitudes toward women and marriage were standard legal protections for husbands, ensuring that their authority within marriage was clearly established and legally enforceable. Women entered marriage knowing exactly how powerless they would become, but they had no choice in the matter. Marriage was mandatory for everyone, and men chose their brides for reasons of lineage and land possession, not love. Indeed, women had no say in who they wed. Their parents or guardians arranged marriages for them. They were married off to strangers they had never met. Sometimes the bride was only a child. Medieval records are filled with girls as young as 8 or 9 years old being married off to older men. On their wedding night, the bride was literally placed in the arms of her new husband and pushed away from her family forever. She would then consummate the marriage by submitting to sex with her new husband, whether or not she wanted to. This was not seen as an intimate act between two willing adults in love, but as a cold legal transaction in which property rights were transferred and the bride was marked as owned. For the rest of her life, she would belong to her husband, her body belonging to him, and her identity obliterated. She took on his name and vanished from the world as an individual. Now she was just the wife, existing to serve the needs of her husband. She was a servant first and foremost, tasked with preparing food and clothing, tending fires and hearth, and generally making her husband's life comfortable. If she had any skills or talents, they were considered wasted and unimportant. Her second task was to bear children, as many as possible. A wife was judged entirely on her ability to produce heirs. Barren wives were despised and abused. Men frequently married multiple wives, keeping as many as their wealth could support, and they regularly beat their wives as a form of discipline. A wife's only protection from abuse lay in her ability to submit and please her husband. A wife's duty was obedience, and a husband's duty was to demand it. If a man failed to assert dominance over his wife, he was mocked by other men and considered a weak leader. The more submissive a wife was, the more secure she became, at least for a time. That is to say, the rare women who did manage to accumulate any kind of influence or respect within their marriages did so only by completely submitting to the system that oppressed them. They gained a measure of security by becoming enforcers of the very structures that had destroyed their own autonomy, teaching their daughters to accept subjugation and helping to arrange marriages for other young women, thereby perpetuating a cycle of abuse and oppression. And this happened on both sides of the equation. In essence, victims of the system became its most ardent supporters because submission was the only path to survival. But death provided no escape from the reach of medieval marriage law. A woman's body after death belonged to her husband, who decided how and where she would be buried. Her children remained his property, and any wealth or influence she might have accumulated during the marriage passed entirely to him. She could not even choose her own final resting place or leave messages for her children without his permission. This grim reality underscores the stark truth of medieval marriage. It wasn't about love, companionship, or even economic partnership. It was about complete subjugation. Every aspect of the institution, from the wedding ceremony itself to the legal frameworks that govern married life, was designed to break a woman's spirit, eliminate her agency, and transform her into a completely controlled resource for male use. It was a deliberate, carefully constructed foundation upon which medieval society was built. And yet, despite the bleakness of this picture, life in medieval Europe offers us moments of hope. Now let's talk about that economic inequality. When we hear about the feudal system, we usually think of peasant farmers working the land for wealthy nobles. If you enjoyed this episode, check out others for more medieval misogyny or medieval economics. Thanks for watching.